The morning sun hung low over the small town, casting a pale golden light across the quiet streets, where the only sounds were the faint hum of a distant car engine and the sporadic chirps of birds. Perched on sagging power lines, the air was crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of dew-soaked grass, and the stillness felt almost sacerdotal. It was shattered by the low rumble of a patrol car, creeping along tree-lined street. Inside, Officers Carter and Miller sat in their usual rhythm, a mix of boredom and bravado etched into their postures. Carter, behind the wheel, slouched slightly, one hand resting lazily on the steering wheel while the other tapped an impatient beat against his thigh. Miller, beside him, skimmed a clipboard of notes he barely cared about, his sharp eyes occasionally flicking up to scan the world outside. Both men wore their authority like a second skin, their confidence unshaken by the mundanity of their routine, their judgments swift and unforgiving, shaped more by instinct than evidence. As the patrol car rounded a corner, Carter's gaze snagged on a lone figure strolling down the sidewalk. A black man, dressed in a neatly pressed button-up shirt and faded jeans, walked with an easy, unhurried stride, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. There was nothing remarkable about him, no frantic movements, no furtive glance. He saw at Carter's posture stiffened, his fingers tightening around the wheel. "What's this guy doing here?" he muttered, his voice thick with suspicion, as if the man's very presence offended some unspoken rule. Miller looked up, his lips curling into a faint, dismissive smirk. "Doesn't look like he fits in," he said, his tone casual but edged with the same instinctive bias that fueled Carter's unease. Without a word, Carter jerked the wheel, the tires screeching against the asphalt as the car lurched to a stop at the curb. The abruptness of it sent a jolt through the quiet morning, a declaration of intent that hung heavy in the air. The two officers climbed out, their boots hitting the pavement with deliberate thuds, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of countless similar encounters. Carter adjusted his belt, his hand lingering near his holster for a moment longer than necessary, a subtle flex of power. Miller stood a step behind, his arms crossed, his expression a mask of detached amusement. "Hey, stop right there." Carter's voice sliced through the stillness, sharp and commanding, leaving no room for negotiation. The man paused mid-step, turning slowly to face them, his dark eyes meeting theirs with a calm curiosity that felt almost out of place. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, his words steady and polite, carrying a quiet dignity that seemed to catch Carter off guard. Carter didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer, his broad frame looming as he sized the man up, his jaw tightening with every passing second. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded, his tone accusatory, as if the man's existence here required justification. The man raised an eyebrow, his composure unshaken despite the aggression radiating from Carter. "I'm walking," he replied simply, his voice even, almost gentle. Carter's eyes narrowed, his patience fraying at the edges. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, jabbing a finger toward the man's chest, close enough to graze the fabric of his shirt. "You're acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" The man tilted his head slightly, a flicker of incredulity crossing his face, though his voice remained steady. "I live here. Is that a problem?" But Carter wasn't listening. To him, the man's calm was a provocation, a refusal to bend under the weight of his authority. "Turn around," he barked, his voice rising, vibrating with a barely contained anger. "Put your hands on the wall." The man's brow furrowed, a quiet defiance simmering beneath his restraint. "Why?" he asked, his tone soft but firm, a question that demanded reason where none was offered. Carter's face darkened, his patience snapping like a taut wire. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he growled, his hand shooting out to seize the man's arm. With a rough yank, he shoved him toward the weathered brick wall of a nearby storefront, the force enough to make the man stumble. "Hey!" the man exclaimed, his voice rising just enough to carry a note of protest as he caught himself against the rough surface. He turned his head, his eyes flashing with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "There's no need for this. I haven't done anything wrong." "You're resisting," Carter declared, his grip tightening as he twisted the man's arm behind his back. Miller nodded silently, his agreement a tacit endorsement of Carter's escalating aggression. Around them, the street began to stir. A small crowd gathered. Dearly risers paused on their morning routines, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Among them, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a worn sweater stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "You can't treat him like that," she called out, clutching her purse as if it were a shield. "He hasn't done anything." Carter whipped around, his hands still clamped on the man's arm, his eyes blazing with fury. "Mind your own business," he shouted, his voice a whip crack that made the woman flinch. "Unless you want to be next," she recoiled, her courage faltering. Though she muttered under her breath, "You're out of line," her words shaky but defiant. Ignoring her, Carter turned back to the man, forcing his hands behind his back with a roughness that bordered on cruelty. The handcuffs snapped into place, the metallic click reverberating in the stillness, a sound that felt final, triumphant. As Carter and Miller began marching the man toward the patrol car, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. A young man with a buzz cut and a faded jacket pulled out his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he raised it to record. Carter's head snapped toward him, his expression darkening. "Put that away," he barked, his voice laced with venom. The young man hesitated, his jaw tightening, but he held his ground. "People need to see this," he said firmly, his defiance a quiet challenge. Carter took a step toward him, his fists clenching. "One more word, and you're under arrest for interfering," he warned, his tone low and menacing. Miller placed a hand on Carter's shoulder, a rare moment of restraint. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered, his voice tight, as if he sensed the situation teetering on the edge of something uglier. Together, they shoved the handcuffed man into the back seat of the patrol car, the door slamming shut with a heavy thud that echoed down the street like a gunshot. As they drove off, Carter glanced at Miller, a smirk tugging at his lips. "See, easy enough. One less troublemaker on the streets." In the back seat, the man sat in silence, his posture straight, his hands bound but his spirit unbowed. He didn't struggle or protest. Instead, he met Carter's gaze in the rearview mirror, his eyes steady, unreadable, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. "Got something to say?" Carter sneered, his bravado masking a flicker of unease. The man's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible. "Not yet," he said simply, his voice a calm promise that sent a shiver down Carter's spine. The patrol car vanished around a corner, leaving behind a street buzzing with tension. The witnesses lingered, their faces etched with discomfort, their whispers a chorus of unease. The young man with the phone lowered it slowly, his hands shaking as he replayed the footage in his mind, a mix of anger and helplessness churning in his chest. The woman who'd spoken up stood rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the empty road, her heart pounding with a righteous fury she couldn't quite voice. For them, this was a moment of injustice witnessed, a wound left raw and unhealed. Inside the police station, the air was thick with the stale scent of coffee and the low hum of fluorescent lights. The door banged open as Carter and Miller strode in, their prisonergems de vis in tow. Heads turned, a ripple of curiosity passing through the room, though no one dared intervene. Carter's grip on James's arm was unrelenting, his chest puffed out with a smug satisfaction that bordered on arrogance. "Get moving," he barked, giving James a rough shove that sent him stumbling forward. James caught himself quickly, his balance regained with a grace that only deepened Carter's irritation. There was no fear in James's eyes, no submission, just that same unnerving calm, a quiet strength that seemed to mock Carter's authority. Miller smirked as they marched James through the station, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you're somebody special, huh? Not here, pal." Carter joined in, his tone venomous. "Yeah, looking at you, I'd say you're right at home in a place like this. Feels familiar, doesn't it?" James didn't reply, his silence a wall they couldn't breach, and it gnawed at Carter's fraying patience. When they reached the holding area, Carter's frustration boiled over. Up against the wall, he ordered, his voice a snarl. James complied, but Carter shoved him anyway, the unnecessary force sending James crashing into the concrete with a dull thud. A few officers nearby glanced over, their expressions flickering with discomfort, but they turned away, unwilling to challenge the scene unfolding before them. "Watch it," James said, his voice low and measured, a warning wrapped in restraint. Carter froze, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer, his breath hot with anger. "What was that?" he shot back, his tone a dare. "I said watch it," James repeated, his gaze locking onto Carter's without a hint of fear. The intensity of it rattled Miller, who shifted uncomfortably, but Carter refused to yield. "You don't get to make demands here," he growled, yanking James back from the wall and steering him toward the holding cell with a roughness that betrayed his unraveling control. As they reached the cell, James turned his head slightly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'd like to call my lawyer," he said evenly, his words a quiet assertion of rights Carter couldn't ignore. Carter let out a harsh, derisive laugh. "Lawyer? Who's gonna waste their time on you? Sit tight, nobody's coming to save you." Miller chuckled, though his eyes darted away, a flicker of doubt creeping into his smug facade. The room grew heavy with unspoken tension, the weight of James's presence shifting the air in ways neither officer could fully grasp. From a nearby desk, Officer Taylor, a weary man with tired eyes and a conscience that hadn't yet dulled, stood up and approached Miller. His voice was low, cautious, but firm. "Are you sure you've got the right guy? I've been looking at his file, and something's off. You might want to double-check." Before Carter cut him off, his voice a whip. "Stay out of it." "Taylor, this is my Cal, you don't need to play detective." Taylor hesitated, his jaw tightening, but he pressed on. "I'm just saying, this could blow up in your face." Carter turned to him, his expression a storm of defiance. "I don't need your advice," he snapped. "I've got it under control." Taylor sighed and stepped back, though the unease in his eyes lingered, a silent prophecy of consequences yet to unfold. Once James was locked in the cell, Carter leaned against the bars, his stare a mix of contempt and challenge. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he sneered. James sat on the narrow bench, his posture relaxed, his demeanor unshaken. "I think you don't know what you're doing," he replied, his voice calm but laced with a quiet certainty that hit Carter like a punch. Carter's jaw clenched, his bravado faltering for a split second. "Watch your mouth," he warned, but the tremor in his tone betrayed his growing unease. James leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving Carter's. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked, his voice soft, almost reflective. "Do you even realize the mistake you've made?" Carter straightened, crossing his arms defensively, his confidence a fragile shield. "You're the one in cuffs. I don't think I'm the one making mistakes." James tilted his head, that faint, enigmatic smile returning. "You'll regret this," he said, his tone conversational, almost kind. Yet it carried a weight that sank deep into Carter's bones. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered across Carter's face, a shadow of uncertainty he couldn't shake. James Davis sat in silence, his calm a beacon of defiance, a promise of revelation yet to come. Outside the cell, the station buzzed with its usual rhythm, but beneath it all, a storm was brewing gone that would soon expose the fragility of power built on prejudice, and the unyielding strength of justice in the face of abuse. The lesson was clear. Authority wielded without accountability was a house of cards, destined to collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. In the dimly lit holding cell, the air hung heavy with the scent of stale coffee and disinfectant. James Davis sat motionless on the cold metal bench, his hands resting lightly on his knees, exuding an eerie calm that seemed to mock the chaos of his surroundings. His dark eyes stared straight ahead, fixed on some invisible point beyond the rusted bars, his face a mask of unreadable stillness. There was no pacing, no nervous twitching known of the restless energy Carter had come to expect from the countless suspects he'd locked up over the years. Instead, James carried an unshakable composure, a quiet strength that gnawed at Carter's gut like a splinter he couldn't pull free. Outside the cell, Carter's boots scuffed against the chipped linoleum floor as he shot a glance back at James, his lips curling into a sneer he didn't bother to hide. Big words for someone stuck behind bars, he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. He shoved himself away from the bars with a grunt, turning sharply to Miller, who lingered a step behind, his clipboard clutched tightly under his arm. "Let's get this over with." "I want this guy in front of a judge before lunch. Move it." His tone was clipped, authoritative, but beneath it simmered a flicker of unease he refused to acknowledge an itch she couldn't scratch. Miller nodded, his movements mechanical, but his hazel eyes darted back toward James as they strode down the corridor. Something about the man unsettled him, though he couldn't pin it down. It wasn't fear or desperation etched into James's posturite, was something else, something deliberate. The way he held himself, even confined in that grim little cage, spoke of a man who wasn't broken, a man who knew more than he let on. Miller's fingers tightened around the clipboard, the edges digging into his palm as he quickened his pace to match Carter's. As they disappeared around the corner, Taylor emerged from the shadows of the precinct's bullpen, his weary frame tense with nervous energy. He approached Carter with cautious steps, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that barely rose above the hum of flickering, fluorescent lights. "Listen, man, I'm telling you something's off with this guy. I've got a bad feeling." His brow furrowed, his hands fidgeting at his sides as if itching to do something, anything, to shake the dread pooling in his chest. Carter wheeled on him, his broad shoulders squaring as irritation flared in his dark eyes. "Drop it." "Taylor," he snapped, cutting him off with a sharpness that made Taylor flinch. "I don't need your theories. You don't know what you're talking about." His words were a wall, unyielding and cold, built to shut down any crack of doubt that might seep into his resolve. Taylor raised his hands in mock surrender, his lips pressing into a thin line. But the unease lingered in his gaze, a silent warning Carter chose to ignore. Back at his desk, Carter hunched over the paperwork, his pen scratching across the forms with a force that threatened to tear the paper. His knuckles whitened around the grip, each stroke a release for the frustration bubbling inside him. James's stillness gnawed at him, an enigma that refused to fit into the neat boxes Carter had constructed over years of busting. Petty thieves and loudmouthed drunks. Why isn't he acting like the others? He muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the clatter of the precinct. Why is he so damn calm? Miller, leaning against a nearby filing cabinet, shrugged lazily. His lanky frame slouched in a way that suggested indifference. Does it matter? They all crack eventually. Give it time. His words were casual, tossed out like a lifeline to dismiss Carter's spiraling thoughts. But there was a tightness in his jaw that betrayed his own flicker of doubt. Carter didn't respond, his eyes narrowing as he stole another glance toward the holding area. Something about James Davis felt different, dangerously different. It clawed at him in a way he couldn't shake, unbeknownst to them. The man they'd dismissed as just another name on a rap sheet wasn't merely biding his time. James Davis sat in that cell with a plan coiled tight in his mind, a chess player waiting for the perfect moment to tip the board. Carter and Miller's arrogance at their blind faith in their own authority had blinded them to the storm brewing just out of sight. They'd underestimated him, and that misstep was about to unravel everything they thought they controlled. Days later, the courtroom buzzed with restless anticipation, a hive of whispers and shifting bodies as spectators crammed into the wooden pews. The air was thick with the scent of polished oak and nervous sweat, the low hum of voices rising and falling like a tide. At the prosecution table, Carter sprawled in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, radiating a smug satisfaction that bordered on theatrical. Miller sat beside him, flipping through a stack of notes with a practiced ease, his lips twitching into a faint smirk. "Open and shut," Carter muttered, his voice a low growl of confidence. "This one's a slam dunk." "Yeah," Miller agreed, his grin widening slightly as he tapped his pen against the table. Just another day at the office. Their certainty was palpable, a shared armor forged from years of bending the system to their will. They'd seen this play out 100 times. Another defendant, another conviction, another notch on their belts. The murmur of the room hushed abruptly as the heavy courtroom doors creaked open, drawing every eye to the figure stepping through. James Davis entered with a measured stride, each step echoing faintly against the polished floor. He wore a navy blue suit, tailored to perfection, the crisp lines accentuating his broad shoulders and commanding presence. His dark hair was neatly combed, his expression serene, yet unyielding, a stark contrast to the disheveled suspects Carter and Miller were used to breaking. Reporters in the back row scrambled to jot down notes, their pens scratching furiously, while spectators leaned forward, their whispers rising in a wave of curiosity. Carter leaned toward Miller, his voice a harsh mutter under the din. "What's with the suit? Thinks he's gonna intimidate us." His tone was laced with mockery, but his fingers twitched against his arm, betraying a flicker of unease. Miller snorted, a sharp, derisive sound. "Yeah, like we're supposed to be impressed by a guy playing dress-up." He shook his head, but his eyes lingered on James, a shadow of doubt creeping into his smirk. James approached the defense table with deliberate calm, setting his sleek leather briefcase down with a soft thud that seemed to reverberate through the room. He stood tall, his posture radiating a quiet authority that silenced the murmurs around him. Moments later, the judge swept in, his black robe billowing as he ascended the bench. The gavel came down with a resounding crack, slicing through the tension like a blade. "Court is now in session," he declared, his voice steady and commanding. The proceedings began with the mundane rhythm charges read. Formalities observed, but Carter and Miller's confidence never wavered. Their smug glances and subtle nods spoke of a victory they already tasted. Then James rose, his presence shifting the air in the room like a sudden gust. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and resonant, cutting through the hum of the courtroom with surgical precision. "Before we proceed, I'd like to introduce myself." The room fell into a stunned silence, every breath held as James paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "My name is James Davis," he said, his gaze sweeping the gallery before locking onto the judge. "I am the chief of police for this district." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, the sound swelling into a cacophony of shocked murmurs. Even the judge's stern features twitched, his eyebrows lifting slightly before he regained his composure. At the prosecution table, Carter's smirk vanished as if struck from his face, his body going rigid. Miller's jaw dropped, his pale skin draining of color as he fumbled his notes. The pages slipping from his grasp, they exchanged a frantic glance, panic sparking in their wide eyes like a live wire. Carter lurched to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is some kind of trick," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're trying to set us up." His hands balled into fists, trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief, as if he could shout the truth away. The judge's gavel slammed down, the sound sharp and final. "Officer Carter, control yourself," he snapped, his tone edged with steel. "One more outburst, and you'll be held in contempt." Carter's mouth opened, a protest teetering on his lips, but Miller's hand shot out, gripping his arm and yanking him back into his seat with a force that rattled the table. James stood unflinching, his calm gaze shifting to Carter and Miller, piercing through their crumbling bravado. "No trick," he said evenly, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of their panic. "Just the truth." Carter's fists clenched beneath the table, his knuckles whitening as anger and confusion warred within him. Beside him, Miller leaned close, his whisper ragged with fear. "What the hell is going on? How did we not know?" His usual swagger had evaporated, leaving behind a man scrambling to grasp a reality slipping through his fingers. James turned back to the judge, his demeanor unshaken. "Your Honor, I intend to demonstrate today not only my innocence, but the grave misconduct of these two officers." His words carried a quiet power, a promise of reckoning that hung heavy in the air. The judge nodded, gesturing for him to proceed, and James stepped forward, his presence commanding every corner of the room. "These officers," he began, his hands sweeping toward Carter and Miller, "profiled me, harassed me, and arrested me without cause. They mocked me, insulted me, treated me like I was less than human because they saw what they wanted to see, not who I am." His voice remained steady, but each word landed like a stone, building a wall of truth they couldn't tear down. Carter couldn't hold back. "You were acting suspiciously," he blurted, his voice strained with frustration, his face flushed red. He half froze from his seat, defiance warring with the dread pooling in his gut. James turned to face him directly, his eyes locking onto Carter's with an intensity that made the officer falter. "Suspicious for walking down the street in my own neighborhood?" he asked, his tone calm but cutting, each syllable dripping with unspoken accusation. "Or was it suspicious because of the color of my skin, The question hung in the air, a challenge that silenced Carter's outburst and sent a fresh wave of whispers through the gallery. The judge's gavel struck again, a sharp command for order, but the tension in the room thickened, pressing down on everyone like a physical weight. James pressed on, addressing the judge with unwavering resolve. "Your Honor, I stand here today not just to clear my name, but to expose an abuse of power that festers far too often. These men didn't see me as a person odd, as their colleague, their superior, or even a fellow citizen. They saw a stereotype, and they acted on it without hesitation." Carter leaned toward Miller, his voice a harsh, panicked hiss. "We need to shut this down. He's turning this into a damn circus." His fingers gripped the table's edge, his nails digging into the wood as if anchoring himself against the tide pulling him under. Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as sweat beaded on his forehead. "How?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. "He's the chief of police." The realization hit him like a punch, stripping away the last vestiges of his composure. James stepped back to the defense table, his movements deliberate and precise. He clicked open his briefcase, the sound crisp in the charged silence, and withdrew a thick stack of documents, handing them to his attorney with a nod. The judge called for a brief recess to review the evidence, and as the courtroom stirred back to life, Carter and Miller remained frozen, the weight of their misjudgment crashing down around them. Their once unshakable confidence lay in ruins, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "Stay quiet," Miller muttered, his voice trembling as he stared at the table. "We can't make this worse." But Carter's eyes burned with fury as he glared across the room at James, his hands shaking with a rage he couldn't unleash. For the first time, they weren't the ones calling the shots. The courtroom had tilted in James's favor, and the truth they'd tried to bury was rising to claim them. When the recess ended, James stood again, the weight of every eye in the room pressing against him. Yet he bore it with a grace that seemed almost defiant. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady as he recounted the events that had brought him here. "I'd like to detail what happened the morning these officers chose to arrest me." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the gallery before settling briefly on Carter and Miller, who shrank under its intensity. "I was walking in my neighborhood, heading home after an early meeting, when a patrol car screeched to a stop beside me. The officers leapt out, shouting at me to freeze, their hands already hovering over their weapons." James's voice remained even, but a flicker of steel edged his words, a memory of the indignity sharpening his tone. "I complied," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly as he relived the moment. "I turned to face them, my hands raised, and asked if there was a problem. Officer Carter barked that I was acting suspiciously. When I asked what I'd done, he ordered me to turn around and put my hands against the wall." Carter shifted in his seat, his jaw clenching as if he could grind the accusation into dust. "I asked why," James said, his voice firm, "because I'd done nothing wrong. I live there, those streets are my home." But instead of answering, Officer Carter grabbed my arm and slammed me against the wall. He paused, his expression hardening as the memory clawed its way to the surface. The force knocked the breath out of me. I stumbled, nearly fell, and when I tried to steady myself, he shouted that I was resisting arrest. The room seemed to shrink, every listener drawn into the vividness of his account. "I didn't fight," James said, his voice growing colder, each word a deliberate strike. "I didn't yell." But that didn't stop him. He shoved me to the ground, drove his knee into my back, and pinned me there while I gasped for air. All the while, he hurled insults, called me boy, asked if I thought I was tough now. His eyes flicked to Carter, a quiet fury burning beneath his calm. "That's not what happened," Carter exploded, bolting to his feet, his voice raw with desperation. "He resisted. He wouldn't comply. We followed procedure." His chest heaved, his face a mask of red-hot defiance, but the tremble in his hands betrayed him. The gavel crashed down, the sound reverberating through the room. "Officer Carter, sit down," the judge ordered, his voice a blade of authority. "You'll have your turn. Interrupt again, and you're in contempt." Carter hesitated, his breath ragged. Before collapsing back into his seat, Miller's hand hovering near his arm as if to restrain him, James resumed, unfazed, his composure a stark contrast to Carter's unraveling. "As I lay there, Choking on dust and humiliation, I asked again why I was being arrested. Officer Carter didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand as if to strike me, only stopping when Miller muttered something about witnesses nearby. His gaze shifted to Miller, who shrank back, his earlier bravado replaced by a sickly pallor. The courtroom held its breath, the weight of James's words sinking deep. Justice, he seemed to say without speaking, wasn't just about clearing his name, was about exposing the cost of unchecked power. The wreckage left when arrogance trumped humanity. Carter and Miller had wielded their authority like a weapon, blind to the man beneath their assumptions, and now the consequences loomed over them, vast and unyielding. James stood as a testament to resilience, a mirror reflecting their failure, and the lesson was clear: power abused would always find its reckoning. The courtroom buzzed with a tense, electric hum as James Davis sat at the witness stand, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles whitening from the strain. His eyes, dark and steady, flickered downward for a moment, tracing the worn grain of the wooden table as if it could anchor him against the storm of memories swirling in his mind. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet intensity, softened at the edges by exhaustion, but still heavy with the unshakable truth of what he'd endured. It was Officer Miller who stepped in first. He began, his words deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. He grabbed me, stopped me in my tracks, and I could feel his grip tighten like he'd already made up his mind about me. Before I even opened my mouth, Miller, seated across the room at the defense table, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His broad shoulders hunched slightly, and his gaze dropped to the tabletop. Avoiding the weight of James's stare, his fingers twitched nervously, betraying the stoic mask he tried to maintain. Beside him, Officer Carter sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles bulged beneath his skin. James pressed on, his tone softening but never wavering. After that, they didn't hesitate. They slapped the cuffs on me, the cold metal biting into my wrists, and marched me out to their patrol car. It wasn't just an arrest, it was a performance. They shoved me forward, parading me through the street like I was some kind of monster they'd hunted down, a trophy for everyone to gawk at. Outside, the morning sun had barely crested the rooftops, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. A small crowd had gathered, neighbors stepping out onto their porches, shopkeepers pausing mid-sweep, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. Some dared to speak up, their voices rising above the shuffle of boots and the jangle of handcuffs. "What's he done?" an older man called out, his tone sharp with indignation. "Why are you treating him like that?" a younger woman added, clutching her phone as if it were a shield. But Officer Carter wheeled around, his face flushed with fury, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Mind your business," he barked, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Anyone else wants to interfere, you'll be in cuffs too." The threat hung there, heavy and suffocating, silencing the onlookers as fear rippled through them. James turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto the judge perched high above the courtroom, a stern figure cloaked in black robes. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady now, resolute despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "I've been in law enforcement myself for over 2 decades. I've faced down armed felons, waded into riots, stared death in the face more times than I can count. I know what it means to serve, to protect. But that morning," he paused, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he fought to keep his composure. "That morning, I wasn't an officer to them. I wasn't even a man. In their eyes, I was nothing, just a shadow they'd already judged guilty, a box they'd checked before they even knew my name." Carter slammed his fist against the table, the sharp crack echoing through the room. His composure shattered, his face twisting into a snarl as he leaned forward. "This is absurd," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "He's spinning some sob story. We were doing our damn jobs keeping the streets safe." The gavel came down hard, a thunderous bang that made the walls tremble. "Officer Carter," the judge snapped, his voice cold as steel, his eyes glinting with warning. "I've told you once already. Interrupt again, and you'll regret it. This is your final warning." Carter slumped back in his seat, his chest heaving, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear, but he barely seemed to hear. James didn't flinch, He didn't even glance at Carter. His focus remained on the judge. His words measured and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing around him. "I've told you what happened to me," he said. "Now I want to hear from the people who saw it, the ones who watch me. Get treated like less than human. Let them tell you what they saw." The air in the courtroom thickened, a palpable tension settling over the rows of spectators as the first witness was summoned. Linda Hall stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor with a determined rhythm. She was a woman in her late 40s, her auburn hair streaked with gray, pulled back into a tight bun that mirrored the steel in her expression. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone, but her gaze was unflinching, locking onto the prosecutor with a quiet fire. She'd been out that morning, walking her scruffy terrier down the familiar stretch of Maple Street. The leash looped loosely around her wrist as the dog sniffed at patches of grass. The day had started so, ordinary birds chirping, a faint breeze rustling the levain till she'd turned the corner and seen the scene unfold. "Ms. Hall," the prosecutor began, his voice smooth and probing. "Can you tell us what you witnessed that morning?" Linda nodded, drawing a deep breath, her chest rising as she steadied herself. "I was just a block from home," she said, her tone clear and unwavering. "I saw the officers approach Mr. Davis, and at first I didn't think much of it. But then I noticed how they moved, how they sounded. It wasn't a conversation. They were yelling, their voices sharp and hostile, like they were trying to break him down before he could even speak." She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line as the memory clawed its way back. "They grabbed him, and when he didn't move fast enough, didn't jump to their orders, Officer Carter shoved him hard, right into the side of their car." The prosecutor leaned in, his elbows resting on the table, his eyes narrowing with focus. "Can you describe what happened next?" Linda's voice tightened, anger seeping through the cracks. "Carter pushed him so forcefully that Mr. Davis's head slammed against the edge of the car door. I saw him flinch, saw the pain flash across his face, but they didn't care. They just kept shouting, treating him like he was nothing, like he wasn't even human." At the defense table, Carter gripped the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white, his lawyer murmuring something futile as his client's frustration simmered. "Did you record any of this, Ms. Hall?" the prosecutor asked, his tone sharpening. Linda nodded firmly. "Yes, I pulled out my phone and started filming. It didn't feel right. What they were doing was wrong, and I needed proof." She straightened in her seat, her resolve hardening. "Carter noticed me. He stopped, turned, and yelled at me to put it away. Said I was interfering with police work. Threatened to arrest me if I didn't stop." The judge's eyes flicked toward the prosecution, his expression unreadable but attentive, a silent signal to proceed. "And did you stop?" the prosecutor pressed. "No," Linda replied, her voice ringing with defiance. "I knew my rights. I wasn't breaking any law, and I wasn't about to let them scare me into shutting up. Someone had to show what was happening." The prosecutor gave a curt nod, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to present the video Ms. Hall recorded." The judge waved a hand, and the bailiff retrieved the evidence. Moments later, the courtroom screen flickered to life. The footage was unsteady, the phone trembling slightly in Linda's hands. But the scene was unmistakable. Carter's voice boomed through the speakers, raw and aggressive, his words dripping with venom as he shouted at James. The camera caught the moment he seized James's arm, wrenching him toward the patrol car with a force that made the onlookers in the courtroom wince. James's head struck the frame with a dull thud, and Carter's sharp command to Linda, "Put that phone down or your necks," sliced through the silence that followed. When the video faded to black, a heavy stillness settled over the room. "Ms. Hall," the prosecutor said, turning back to her, "does this accurately reflect what you saw?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation, her voice cutting through the tension. "That's exactly what happened." The defense attorney rose, his posture stiff, his face etched with unease. "Ms. Hall," he began, his tone measured but probing, "wouldn't you agree that filming police during an arrest could escalate a tense situation?" Linda's eyes narrowed, a spark of indignation flaring. "I'd say police officers should act professionally no matter who's watching. I wasn't the one escalating anything, they were." He pressed further, his voice tightening. "But your presence, Your recording that have distracted them from ensuring public safety. Linda didn't blink. I wasn't the one screaming threats or slamming someone into a car. I stayed back, didn't interfere. If anything, I was the one protecting the public by holding them accountable. The attorney's jaw clenched, a flicker of frustration crossing his face as he realized he'd hit a wall. He stepped back, knowing her words only bolstered her credibility. "One last question, Ms. Hall," the prosecutor said, his tone softening slightly. "Why did you come forward today?" Linda took a slow, steadying breath, her hands folding in her lap as she gathered her thoughts. "Because what I saw wasn't just one man being mistreated," she said, her voice thick with conviction. "It was power run wild, twisted into something ugly. If people like me don't speak up, it'll happen again and again. Someone has to say, this isn't right. Justice demands it." Her words lingered, a solemn echo that seemed to settle into the bones of everyone listening. As Linda stepped down, her shoulders squared with quiet dignity, the prosecution called the next witness. John Carterno, relation to the officer, strode to the stand, a tall, no-nonsense man with a weathered face and a steady gait. The irony of the shared name wasn't lost on the room, a faint ripple of amusement cutting through the tension, though John's grim expression made it clear he wasn't here for levity. After being sworn in, he settled into the chair, his hands resting calmly on his knees, though his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "Mr. Carter," the prosecutor began, "what did you see that morning?" John's voice was firm, resonant, cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom. "I was parked about 30 feet away, just sitting in my car, drinking my coffee. I saw two officers approach Mr. Davis. Right off the bat, something felt off. They didn't walk up like they were asking questions. They moved in fast, aggressive, like they'd already pinned a crime on him." He frowned, his brow furrowing as the memory sharpened. "They started yelling, their voices loud enough to carry over the street noise. It wasn't a discussion, it was an attack." "What happened next?" the prosecutor urged, leaning forward. John's face tightened, a flicker of anger crossing his features. "One of them grabbed him, shoved him right into a wall. Hard enough that I heard the impact from where I was sitting." He glanced toward the defense table, his gaze steady. It was Carter, Officer Carter. Miller was there too, hanging back, watching like some kind of silent partner. "Didn't stop it. Didn't say a word." "And what did you do?" the prosecutor asked. John shifted in his seat, his hands clenching briefly. "I got out of my car. I didn't know what was going on, but it didn't look right known if it did. I called out, asked what was happening." He paused, his tone growing colder. "That's when Carter turned on me, pulled his gun, aimed it straight at my chest, and yelled at me to shut up or I'd be next." The courtroom stirred, a wave of gasps and murmurs rolling through the crowd. The prosecutor raised a hand, silencing them. "Let me be clear, Mr. Carter, you're saying Officer Carter drew his weapon on you for asking a question?" John nodded, his voice steady as stone. "Exactly. I wasn't armed, wasn't threatening anyone. I just wanted answers." But he didn't explain, didn't calm things down. He went straight to intimidation like that was his instinct. "How did that make you feel?" the prosecutor asked, stepping closer. John's jaw tightened, a shadow passing over his face, like I was nothing to him, like he didn't care about right or wrong, just about keeping control. He acted like he was untouchable, like no one could question him. "Not me, not Mr. Davis, not anyone." The words hung heavy, a damning testament to the arrogance of unchecked power. "What happened after that?" the prosecutor pressed. John exhaled sharply. "I backed off hard too, with a gun in my face, but I didn't stop watching. I saw Carter shove Mr. Davis into the patrol car, slamming him so hard his head hit the frame. Heard him mocking him, throwing insults like it was a game. And Miller, he just stood there, arms crossed, letting it happen." The prosecutor let the silence stretch, allowing John's account to sink in. Each witness, Linda with her quiet courage, John with his unflinching resolve, added another layer to the story, peeling back the veneer of authority to reveal the rot beneath. Carter and Miller had wielded their badges not as shields of justice, but as weapons of dominance, and the consequences of that abuse were now laid bare. The lesson was clear: power, when twisted, devours trust. And justice demands a reckoning, the truth the courtroom could no longer ignore. As the case against the officers grew darker, deeper, and undeniable, in the packed courtroom, the air buzzed with tension as John Carter's lawyer jolted to his feet, his voice slicing through the murmur like a jagged blade. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is speculating about my client's intentions, purely subjective nonsense." His words dripped with indignation, his hands clenched at his sides as if restraining a storm of frustration. The judge, perched high above the fray, lifted a hand with the calm authority of someone long accustomed to chaos. "Sustained," she said, her tone even but firm. "Mr. Carter, please, stick to what you saw with your own eyes." John, seated in the witness box, didn't flinch. His broad shoulders remained steady, his gaze unwavering, a quiet strength radiating from him despite the interruption. He nodded once, a small gesture that carried the weight of resolve. "What I saw was more than enough," he said, his voice low but resonant, cutting through the room like a steady drumbeat. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the worn wooden edge of the stand, fingers tracing the grain as if grounding himself in the moment. The way they stared at him, cold, hard, like he wasn't even human, the way they barked orders, their voices sharp and impatient. It wasn't how you'd talk to a person. To them, he was just an obstacle, something they wanted gone, swept away like trash on the street. The prosecutor, a weary man with a keen glint in his eye, let the silence stretch, savoring the unease that thickened the air. He paced slowly, his polished shoes tapping a deliberate rhythm on the hardwood floor, each step amplifying the anticipation. Then, with a voice smooth as velvet yet edged with steel, he turned to John. "Mr. Carter, in your view, did Mr. Davis do anything at all that might have excused what those officers did?" The question hung there, heavy, daring anyone to challenge its weight. John didn't hesitate. "Nothing," he said, the word landing like a stone dropped into still water. His eyes narrowed slightly, not out of anger but from the clarity of memory. He was calm as could be. No shouting, no struggling. All he did was ask one simple question. They'd stopped him, that's it. And for that, they treated him like some kind of monster. His voice trembled just enough to betray the outrage simmering beneath his composed exterior. A flicker of emotion that made the jurors lean forward in their seats. The defense attorney shot up again, his face flushed with exasperation, his tie slightly askew as if he'd tugged at it one too many times. "Mr. Carter," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut glass, "you said you were, 30 feet away. Isn't it possibly event that you missed something? That distance could blur details, distort what you think you saw." His words were a challenge, a desperate swing to reclaim control, but his fidgeting hands betrayed his nerves. John met the attorney's glare head-on, unflinching, his jaw set like iron. "I saw enough," he replied, his voice steady as a heartbeat, each syllable deliberate. "And the video from M. Hall, it backs up every word I've said." His eyes flicked briefly to the jurors, a silent plea for them to see the truth he carried. The defense attorney's lips pressed into a thin, tight line, his frustration palpable as he pushed further. "So you're telling us you can read my client's mind from 30 feet away? You know exactly what he was thinking. That's a bold claim, don't you think?" John's gaze didn't waver. "I don't need to crawl inside his head," he countered, his voice rising with a quiet ferocity that filled the room. "I saw what he did. His fists, his shouts, the way he shoved Mr. Davis like he was nothing. Those actions screamed louder than any thoughts he might have had." The prosecutor stepped in smoothly, redirecting the focus with a deft hand. "Mr. Carter, one last thing. Why are you here today? Why testify?" John's eyes drifted to James Davis, seated silently at the plaintiff's table, his face etched with a mixture of weariness and resolve. For a moment, John's stern expression softened, revealing a flicker of empathy, a shared understanding of the stakes. "Because it's right," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "If this is how they treated him out in the open, with people watching what happens when the streets are empty, when no one's there to see, people deserve to know what's really going on." His words lingered, a cold shiver rippling through the courtroom, a stark reminder of the stakes beyond these walls. As John stepped down, the atmosphere shifted, the tension coiling tighter. Officer Carter and his partner, Miller, sat rigid at the defense table, their once cocky demeanor cracking under the mounting pressure. Carter's fingers drummed nervously on the tabletop, his knuckles whitening with each tap, while Miller's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The next witness hadn't even taken the stand, but already the story was shifting. John's testimony painting not just a picture of one bad day, but a chilling glimpse into a system rotten with abuse. Justice, it seemed, wasn't just about this case. It was a mirror held up to power itself, and the reflection was ugly. When Officer Carter's turn came, he strode to the stand with a forced swagger, his uniform crisp but his hands betraying him as he fumbled with his tie. He straightened up, chest puffed out, trying to reclaim the authority he felt slipping away. "Can you explain what happened that day?" his attorney asked, his tone coaxing, almost pleading. Carter cleared his throat, his voice booming with a defensive edge. "We weren't targeting anyone. We were doing our jobs, responding to suspicious behavior like we're trained to. That's it." His words were loud, but they rang hollow, a shield he wielded against the doubt creeping into his own mind. The prosecutor rose, his movements sharp and predatory. "Suspicious behavior," he repeated, his voice cutting through Carter's bluster like a knife. "What exactly about Mr. Davis screamed suspicious to you?" Carter faltered, his bravado flickering as he searched for an answer. He matched a description. "A suspect in the area," he said, the words tumbling out too fast, too thin. The prosecutor tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "And that description was what, exactly?" Carter's gaze dropped to his lap for a split second, a crack in his armor, before he forced it back up. "A black male in the area." He looked out of place, his jaw tightened, as if bracing for the blow he knew was coming. The prosecutor stepped closer, his voice steady, but laced with incredulity. "A black male. That's it. No height, no clothes, no scars, just black. And that was enough for you to act." Carter's face reddened, but he didn't answer, the silence damning him more than words ever could. The prosecutor pressed on, relentless. "So your reason to believe was what, officer? That a black man walking down the street didn't belong there?" The question was a whip, and Carter flinched, his defiance crumbling under its lash. Miller followed, his steps to the stand hesitant, his shoulders hunched as if he could shrink from the spotlight. His eyes flicked nervously to Carter, then away. A man already drowning in the tide of his partner's unraveling. "Why'd you stop Mr. Davis?" the defense attorney asked, his voice softer now, almost resigned. Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "We were following protocol." He fit the reports. Acting suspicious in the area. His voice was thin, unsteady, a threadbare excuse unraveling with every word. The prosecutor pounced. "Protocol," he echoed, his tone mocking. "Let's dig into that. Did Mr. Davis fight you? Refuse your orders?" Miller shifted, his hands twisting in his lap. He asked questions, didn't comply right away. "Questions?" The prosecutor's eyebrows shot up, his voice rising with disbelief. "He asked why you stopped him, and that's resisting to you. Or was it just inconvenient, because you had no real reason to stop him?" Miller's mouth opened, then closed, his tongue tied by the truth he couldn't face. The prosecutor leaned in. "What part of that report described Mr. Davis specifically?" Miller's eyes darted to Carter again, pleading for rescue, but Carter stared straight ahead, offering nothing. "It just said a black male in the neighborhood," Miller mumbled, his voice barely audible. "And that justified pinning him to a wall, slamming him into a car so hard he hit his head." The prosecutor's words were a hammer, each one driving the nail deeper. "Was he dangerous, officer? Did he threaten you?" Miller's head shook almost imperceptibly. "No," he whispered, the admission a surrender. The prosecutor stepped back, letting the silence choke the room. "So Mr. Davis's crime may his only crime was existing where you didn't think he should. That's what this comes down to." Miller slumped, defeated, his bravado stripped bare. The defense attorney leapt up, his voice shrill with desperation. "Your Honor, my clients acted on their training, on the information they had. They were protecting the community precautions, not prejudice." But the prosecutor turned, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. "Precautions," he said, his voice a quiet thunder. "What we've seen isn't caution. It's be a straw, ugly bias. A man was harassed, humiliated, beaten. Not for what he did, but for who he was. Carter couldn't take it. He surged to his feet, his face a mask of fury. We didn't discriminate. He roared, his voice cracking with rage. We were keeping the neighborhood safe. The judge's gavel crashed down. A sharp crack that silenced him. Officer Carter, sit, she barked, and he obeyed, his chest heaving, his anger a wildfire he couldn't contain. The prosecutor faced the judge, his voice calm but unyielding. Your Honor, their own words betray them. No evidence, no reason, just an assumption dressed up as duty. That's not justice. That's abuse. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking into every corner. Then James Davis stood. His movements were slow, deliberate, each step a testament to the burden he carried. The courtroom hushed as he took center stage, his presence a quiet command that stilled even the rustle of papers. He turned to the judge, his deep voice rolling out like a tide. Your Honor, I'm grateful to speak here not just for myself, but for every soul who suffers in the shadows. His eyes swept the room, pausing on Carter and Miller, who couldn't meet his gaze. Their heads bowed under the weight of shame. What happened to me wasn't a fluke, he continued, his tone steady but edged with a quiet fire. It wasn't some rare misstep. It was a symptom of festering wound in a system that's supposed to protect, not prey. He paused, letting the words settle, his broad hands clasped before him as if in prayer. That morning, those officers didn't see me, not James Davis, not a neighbor, not even a fellow cop. They saw a threat they could dominate, a target for their power. His voice grew sharper, cutting through the stillness. I'm the chief of police. 20 years I've worn this badge, proud to serve everyone and not just some. But that day, my rank, my service, my life fight meant nothing. To them, I was just a black man, guilty by default. He turned to the gallery, where reporters scribbled furiously and onlookers sat rapt. This isn't about one stop. It's about what happens when power forgets justice, when it twists into something cruel. And the lesson here, his eyes burned with resolve. Abuse like that doesn't just hurt the victim, it corrodes us all. It's a warning. Unchecked power breeds monsters, and we're the ones who pay. His words echoed. A call to reckoning as Carter and Miller shrank further, their fragile defenses shattered under the truth of a man who refused to be silenced. The air in the courtroom hung thick with tension, a palpable weight pressing down on every soul present as Chief James Davis stood tall, his broad shoulders squared against the storm brewing within him. His dark eyes burned with a quiet fury, tempered by years of discipline, as he addressed the room, not just the judge, not just the attorneys, but every onlooker perched in the creaking wooden benches of the gallery. Honor, he began, his voice low but resonant, slicing through the stillness like a blade honed by conviction. This isn't just about me. This is about something far bigger, something that cuts to the core of what we stand for. It's about the slow, insidious unraveling of trust, the fragile thread that ties law enforcement to the very people we've taken an oath to shield. When those who wear the badge misuse their power, they don't just wound the ones, they single up, they fracture the entire foundation we're built on. They make it damn near impossible for every honest officer out there to walk the streets, look folks in the eye, and earn the respect they deserve. He paused, drawing a deep breath, his chest rising as if gathering the strength to push his words further into the hearts of those listening. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a stark contrast to the fire in his tone as he pressed on. If this could happen to me, a man who's carried a badge for decades, who's held authority in his hands, who's got a voice loud enough to be heard, what hope is there for those who don't? What happens to the ones with no platform, no power, no way to fight back? The ones who get sized up, harassed, stripped of their dignity just for standing on the wrong corner at the wrong damn time? His voice climbed, each syllable laced with a raw, unshakable resolve that seemed to ripple through the room, stirring the air. The silence that followed was heavy, unbroken, every gaze locked on him. Even the judge, perched high on his bench, leaned forward ever so slightly, his weathered face a mask of inscrutability, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of semi-think attention, perhaps, or reluctant respect. James steadied himself, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand, knuckles whitening as he fought to keep his emotions in check. This case, he continued, his tone leveling out, firm and unyielding. It's not just a chance to make two officers answer for what they did. It's a megaphone way to shout loud and clear that nobody, not even those entrusted with enforcing the law, gets to stand above it. It's our shot to say we won't stomach abuse, we won't turn a blind eye to prejudice, and we sure as hell won't let the trust people place in us be betrayed. His words landed like hammer strikes, precise and deliberate, each one driving home a truth too long ignored. The prosecutor, a weary man in a crisp suit, rose from his seat, his expression a mix of professional restraint and unmistakable admiration. "Chief Davis," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge of curiosity, "what do you hope this case achieves?" James didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "Justice," he replied, the word ringing out like a bell. "Not just for me, but for every single person who's been treated like they're less than human because of their skin, their roots, or just where life dropped them. I want accountability. These officers need to feel the weight of what they've done, crashing down on them. And I want this system to stop hiding from itself, to face the cracks and fix what's broken, no matter how long it's been ignored." Across the room, the defense attorney shot to his feet, his narrow face taut with irritation, his tie slightly askew as if he'd tugged at it one too many times. "Chief Davis," he snapped, his voice sharp and clipped, "don't you think you're blowing this out of proportion? This was one incident, not some grand conspiracy woven into the system." James turned to him, his gaze sharpening into something fierce, almost predatory. "One incident," he echoed, his tone slicing through the attorney's protest like a knife. "You really think this was the first time those two stepped over the line? The first time someone in this community got targeted, roughed up, treated like trash for no good reason? If you believe that, you're either too green to see what's right in front of you or too stubborn to admit it." The attorney opened his mouth to argue, but James barreled forward, his voice rising to command the space. "I'm not inflating a damn thing. I'm the living, breathing proof of what happens when bias runs wild. And if I've got to stand here, lay it all bare, to make that clear, then that's exactly what I'll do." A murmur stirred in the gallery, soft gasps, whispered agreements, but the judge raised a hand, his gavel hovering like a silent threat. The room stilled instantly. "Chief Davis," he said, his voice deep and measured, cutting through the tension, "you've made your stance plain. Anything else before we move on?" James straightened, his broad frame seeming to grow even taller, his uniform crisp despite the weight of the day. "Just this, Your Honor," he said, his eyes locking with the judge's. "Wearing this badge is a sacred calling. It's not a club to swing at the weak, or a shield to hide behind. It's a duty, a trust. And when that trust shatters, it's not just one person who bleeds, it's the whole community. The institution, the very idea of justice itself." He stepped back, returning to his seat with deliberate steps, the silence in his wake so thick it felt like the room held its breath. No one dared move, the gravity of his words sinking deep into every corner. As James settled into his chair, the defense team scrambled to regroup, their whispers frantic but futile against the tide turning in the room. Officers Carter and Miller sat at their table, the air around them crackling with unease. Carter's jaw was locked tight, his thick neck flushed red, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the tabletop. Beside him, Miller looked smaller, diminutive, pale face drawn, his hands clutching the table's edge as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Their attorney leaned in, his voice a hurried hiss, but Carter didn't so much as glance his way, his eyes fixed on some distant point, simmering with defiance. The judge re-entered, his black robe sweeping the floor, his presence a steady anchor amid the storm. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, peering briefly over the packed courtroom before speaking, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of authority. "This trial has carried a heavy burden," he began, his gaze drifting from the prosecution to the defense, lingering on the two officers. "We've heard accounts, sifted through evidence, and seen the glaring divide between justice and prejudice laid bare. Officers Carter and Miller, you were given power to safeguard this community. Instead, you twisted it, driven not by duty, but by bias and a need to intimidate. You didn't just harm an innocent man. You chipped away at the trust people place in the badge you wear." He paused, letting the indictment settle, his words hanging in the air like a judge's sentence before the gavel falls. Effective immediately, he continued, his tone unwavering, you are both suspended without pay, pending a full investigation by your department. This court strongly recommends disciplinary measures up to and including termination if the evidence holds. The silence that followed shattered as Carter slammed his fist on the table, the crack echoing like a gunshot. This is a farce, he roared, his face crimson, veins bulging at his temples. The systems stacked against us were just doing our jobs. The judge's gavel crashed down, a sharp retort that silenced the outburst. Officer Carter, he said, his voice icy, control yourself or you'll be escorted out. Carter lurched to his feet, jabbing a finger toward the bench. You're punishing us for what we're trained to. This isn't justice, it's a damn witch hunt. The gallery buzzed, a swell of murmurs rising as heads turned. Miller tugged at Carter's sleeve, his voice a desperate whisper. Sit down. You're digging us deeper. But Carter shook him off, his rage a living thing, wild and uncontainable. Two uniformed officers stepped forward, their boots thudding softly on the hardwood floor, their faces stern but professional. Carter glared at them, his chest heaving, his fists clenched tight. This isn't over, he spat, loud enough for the words to bounce off the walls. You'll all pay for this. One of the officers gripped his arm, firm but calm. Let's go, he said, and for a moment, Carter resisted, his body rigid with fury. Then, reluctantly, he let himself be let out, his boots stomping a furious rhythm. As he passed the gallery, his eyes swept the crowd filled not with remorse, but with a bitter, seething contempt. The door slammed shut behind him, a final punctuation to his exit, leaving the room steeped in a stunned hush. Miller stayed rooted to his seat, his head bowed low, his shoulders slumped as if the fight had drained out of him entirely. When the judge turned to him, his voice softened slightly. Officer Miller, anything to say? Miller hesitated, his throat working as he swallowed hard. No, Your Honor, he mumbled, barely audible, his eyes fixed on the table. The judge nodded, then shifted his attention back to the room. Let this be a lesson, he said, his words deliberate. The law bends for no one, not even those who enforce it. This case isn't just about one wrong, it's about making justice real, not just a hollow promise. The prosecutor rose, her posture straight, her voice steady, but carrying a quiet fire. Your Honor, I request that this court's findings be sent to the oversight committees. This isn't just about two officers, it's a crack in the system that demands a broader reckoning. The judge inclined his head, noted and approved. The findings will be forwarded for review. James, seated at the prosecution's table, remained still, though his eyes shimmered with the weight of the moment, a blend of exhaustion, resolve, and a flicker of hope. When the judge met his gaze, there was a fleeting, unspoken exchange and acknowledgement of the courage it took to stand against the tide. The gavel fell one last time, a crisp, final note. Court adjourned. The room erupted soft applause from some, hushed conversations from others. Reporters scrambling for the exits to chase the story. Miller stood slowly, his face ashen, his movements heavy. His attorney clapped a hand on his shoulder, murmuring, "It's Donna, let it go." Miller nodded, a ghost of a man, and shuffled out, defeat clinging to him like a shadow. James rose too, shaking hands with his attorney, accepting quiet words of support from those in the gallery who'd stood by him. There was no triumph in his expression, no gloating smile. This was no cause for celebration, but a solemn milestone in a fight that stretched far beyond these walls. The verdict's echoes didn't stop at the courtroom doors. Within hours, the streets outside buzzed with voice changer, hope, demands for change. Social media lit up, posts flooding in with clips of Carter's outburst, snippets of James's testimony, calls for reform that grew louder with every share. The scales of justice had tipped, but the battle for what they stood for was only beginning. A reminder that power unchecked breeds ruin, and that true justice demands not just punishment, but a reckoning deep enough to reshape the world it serves. The air was thick with tension that morning, a palpable electricity humming through the streets as dawn broke over the courthouse steps. A sea of people had gathered, their faces etched with determination, anger, and a flicker of hope that had been dormant for far too long. Signs bobbed above their heads like a forest of defiant trees: no justice, no peace. End racial profilingiach won a silent scream against a system that had bruised too many lives. Their voices rose in unison, a rhythmic chant that rolled through the city like thunder, shaking windows and rattling the complacency of those who had turned a blind eye for years. This wasn't just a protest, it was a reckoning. Among the throng stood a young man, barely out of his teens, clutching a megaphone as though it were a lifeline. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to say. "This isn't just about one man," he shouted, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "This is about every single person who's been stopped for no reason. Every family ripped apart because someone with a badge thought they were above the law. We're done waiting. We demand change or you'll change." The crowd roared back, their cheers a tidal wave of agreement, amplifying his words until they seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unignorable. His chest heaved as he lowered the megaphone, his dark eyes scanning the faces around him. He saw his own story reflected in their series of sidelong glances, unjust stops, and the quiet terror of knowing the system wasn't built to protect him. Today, though, he felt something shift inside him, a spark of power he hadn't known he possessed. A few steps away, an older woman stood with her fist raised high, her silver hair catching the morning light like a beacon. Her knuckles ached from years of hard work, but she held her arm steady, a symbol of resilience forged through decades of silence. "We've been quiet too long," she called out, her voice weathered but fierce. "This is our moment. They can't ignore us anymore." Her words carried the weight of a lifetime spent watching injustice unfold. Neighbors harassed, sons questioned, a community held under a shadow of suspicion. She remembered the nights she'd prayed for her own children to come home safe, the dread that gripped her every time a siren wailed in the distance. Now, as she looked at the swelling crowd, she felt a surge of pride mingled with sorrow. She wasn't just here for herself, she was here for every mother who'd held her breath, waiting for the phone to ring with bad news. The protest wasn't a solitary flame, it was a wildfire, leaping from the city to neighboring towns and blazing through major urban centers. Across the state, in every corner, people took to the streets: teachers, barbers, students, grandparents carrying their own scars from a system that had failed them. Community leaders emerged from the chaos, their voices steady as they organized marches and rallies that swelled with every passing hour. The demands grew louder, more insistent, reverberating through megaphones and homemade signs: justice, accountability, reform. At one massive rally, Reverend Paul Bryant stepped onto a makeshift stage, his presence commanding as the crowd of thousands fell silent. A man of faith with a voice like rolling thunder, he gripped the microphone and leaned forward, his eyes burning with conviction. "This case isn't a lone incident," he declared. "It's a symptom of a sickness, a system that's been broken for too long. But healing doesn't come without cost. We need accountability, and we need reform, and we need it now." His words struck like a hammer, each syllable a call to action that rippled through the masses. Reverend Bryant wasn't just a preacher today, he was a warrior for justice, haunted by the countless parishioners who'd come to him with tales of profiling and abuse. He'd seen the tears, heard the pleas, and now he channeled that pain into a force that couldn't be ignored. The pressure wasn't confined to the streets, it climbed the steps of power, reaching the local police department and state officials caught in the swelling storm. Human rights organizations seized the moment, their statements sharp and unyielding as they condemned the officers' actions and demanded sweeping changes. Vanessa Carter, the steely-eyed head of a leading civil rights group, appeared on national television, her presence radiating authority. Sitting across from a probing interviewer, she leaned forward, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "The James Davis case is a wake-up call," she said, her words cutting through the studio's polished silence. "We've watched unchecked power turn into abuse over and over again. It's not enough to talk about change. We need mandatory bias training, stricter oversight, and real consequences for officers who cross the line." The reporter, sensing the gravity of her resolve, pressed further. "Do you believe this case will spark lasting change?" Vanessa's jaw tightened, her gaze unwavering. "It has to," she replied. "The people won't settle for less. The momentum is here, and we're not stepping back." Behind her composed exterior, Vanessa carried the weight of every story she'd documented, files stacked high with names, dates, and injustices that had fueled her fight for years. This wasn't just a case to her. It was a crusade. Meanwhile, the police department reeled under a spotlight they couldn't escape. The interim chief, a woman with a calm demeanor masking her unease, faced a barrage of cameras at a hastily called press conference. Her hands gripped the podium as she spoke, her voice carefully measured. "I want to assure the community that we hear their concerns," she said, her eyes flickering briefly to the notes in front of her. "Effective immediately, we're launching a full review of our policies and practices. Every officer will undergo mandatory training on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques." The room erupted with questions, reporters shouting over one another. "What about Carter and Miller?" one demanded, referencing the officers at the heart of the scandal. "Will they face further discipline?" The chief paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The investigation is ongoing," she said, "but let me be clear, there will be accountability." Outside, protesters encircled the building. Their signs stark against the gray concrete actions speak louder than words. Skepticism hung heavy in the air, words were cheap, and the crowd knew it. Among them stood a young woman, her arms crossed. Her eyes narrowed as she listened to the chief's promises. She'd heard it all before, empty assurances, after her cousin was roughed up during a routine stop. She whispered to her friend beside her, "I'll believe it when I see it." The unrest spilled into community meetings, where the air crackled with frustration and raw emotion. In one packed room, a mother rose to her feet, her hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled tissue. "My son was stopped by police just weeks before James Davis's arrest," she said, her voice quivering with a mix of grief and fury. "He's 16, and they treated him like a criminal for walking home from school. How many more stories like this do we need before something changes?" Tears streamed down her face as she sat, the room falling silent save for the soft sobs of those who understood her pain too well. Another voice broke the stillness, a retired officer, his gray hair thinning, his shoulders stooped from years of service. He took the microphone with a steady hand, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. "I wore that badge for 30 years, he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "Most of us want to do right by people, but we need better training, better oversight, and a culture that doesn't let abuse slide. Without that, we're just spinning our wheels." His words hung there, a rare admission from someone who'd once been on the other side of the divide. He'd seen the good and the ugly in his time, officers who cared, and those who wielded power like a club. Retirement hadn't dulled his sense of duty. It had sharpened his clarity. The James Davis case became a lightning rod, igniting fierce political debates that echoed through state legislatures. Bills were drafted in a flurry, stricter oversight, funding for community safety programs, each one a fragile promise of change. But opposition reared its head, loud and unyielding. A local police union representative stepped into the fray, his voice gruff as he defended his colleagues. "Our officers are being painted as villains for doing their jobs," he argued in a televised interview, his brow furrowed. "Mistakes happen, but this backlash is crippling law enforcement." His words lit a match, and protesters erupted anew, accusing the union of dodging responsibility. James Davis himself, the quiet eye of this storm, faced the press with a composure that belied the chaos swirling around him. "I'm thankful people are speaking out," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But this isn't just about Carter and Miller, it's about a system that's lost the trust of the people. It's meant to serve. Change won't be easy, but it's overdue." His calm exterior masked a tumult of emotions, relief at the support, fear of the spotlight, and a simmering hope that his ordeal might mean something bigger. In the weeks that followed, the call for reform didn't fade, it grew, weaving itself into the fabric of everyday life. Schools opened their classrooms to discussions on justice and profiling, teachers guiding students through uncomfortable truths with care. Churches and community centers became hubs of education, hosting forums where citizens learned their rights, their voices rising in tandem with their knowledge. The police department, under relentless pressure, fast-tracked its reforms. Officers filed into workshops on implicit bias, their faces a mix of curiosity and resistance as trainers laid bare the systemic flaws they'd long ignored. For some, it was a revelation. For others, a bitter pill. The department stood firm. Change wasn't optional. As reforms took root, skeptics sharpened their focus. "Training's a start," one protester muttered, his breath visible in the chilly air. "But what about consequences? How do we know this won't happen again?" The answer emerged slowly: a civilian oversight board, tasked with reviewing complaints and ensuring transparency. It wasn't perfect. Reactions ranged from cautious optimism to outright distrust, but for many, it was a foothold toward justice. Nationally, the case became a symbol. Its echoes felt in newsrooms and protest chants alike. "Enough is enough" rang out across the country, a mantra for a movement that refused to relent. Locally, James Davis, now head of the police force, refused to let the momentum slip away. He stood before a room of officers, his uniform crisp, his expression resolute. "These sessions aren't about blame," he began, his voice steady as he launched the first of many mandatory training programs. "They're about understanding. If we can't face our biases, how can we protect a diverse community?" Most officers nodded, pens scratching notes, but a few in the back exchanged wary looks. Sergeant Harris, a veteran with a lined face and a no-nonsense air, raised his hand. "Chief, isn't this a bit much? We've done this job for years without these lectures." Davis met his gaze, unflinching. "And yet, Sergeant, look at the rift between us and the people. If we don't fix this, we lose everything." Harris fell silent, but the room buzzed with unspoken tension. Davis pressed forward, inviting community leaders to share their stories, raw, unfiltered accounts that left officers squirming or somber. A young man, his voice steady but thick with pain, stood before them. "I was taught to fear you," he said, locking eyes with the uniformed men and women. "Stopped too many times to count, just for existing. How can we trust you when that's our reality?" An officer muttered in the back, but Davis cut in sharply. "If we can't hear this, we don't deserve the badge." The reforms deepened: buddy cameras, stricter reporting, a culture of accountability. Younger officers like Ramirez, a rookie with bright eyes and an earnest heart, embraced it. "This is how we rebuild," he said, his voice eager, but the old guard bristled. Lieutenant Daniels, grizzled and skeptical, spoke up at a meeting. "Chief, these changes make us feel like the enemy." Davis didn't waver. "Then we prove we're not." The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed, it was a demand met with struggle. The abuse of power had cracked open a wound, but the consequences of ignoring it would fester far longer. For every voice raised, every sign held high, the story of James Davis and those who rallied around him underscored a truth as old as time. Power unchecked breeds ruin, and only through accountability could trust and healing begin to take root. On a crisp morning in Oakwood, the air carried a faint chill, and the streets were still waking up under the soft glow of dawn. Chief James Davis stood in his office, gazing out the window at the town he'd sworn to protect. The weight of his badge felt heavier these days, not from pride, but from the relentless scrutiny that shadowed his every move. His officers felt it too, their frustration bubbling up in quiet grumbles and tense exchanges. "How are we supposed to do our jobs when every step we take is picked apart?" One of them had snapped during a heated briefing, his voice taut with exasperation. Davis turned from the window, his dark eyes steady, unflinching. "Being watched comes with the territory," he said, his tone calm but firm, like a river smoothing over jagged stones. "If we can't stand the light of day, then we're not doing it right." The department was a fractured place, a house divided against itself. Davis often found himself at the center of storms, caught between officers who embraced his push for reform and those who saw it as a betrayal of their old ways. The reformers, younger and eager, argued passionately about transparency and trust, their voices ringing with conviction. The old guard, grizzled and set in their routines, pushed back just as fiercely, their words dripping with resentment. "This is punishment dressed up as progress," one veteran muttered, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Davis didn't just listen, felt the weight of their anger, the sting of their distrust. Yet he stood his ground, mediating with a patience that masked the exhaustion creeping into his bones. Justice, he believed, wasn't about picking sides, it was about finding a path forward, even when the road was rough and uncharted. Beyond the station's walls, the resistance grew louder. The police union, a towering force of tradition, raised its voice against him like a chorus of dissent. At a press conference, the union president, a burly man with a face carved from years of defiance, stood before a sea of microphones, his words sharp and accusing. "Chief Davis's policies are tearing us apart," he declared, his voice booming with indignation. "They're crushing officer morale and tying our hands when we need them most." The cameras flashed, capturing the tension in his furrowed brow, the clenched fists at his sides. Back at the station, Davis watched the broadcast, his jaw tight, but his resolve unshaken. When reporters swarmed him later, hungry for a rebuttal, he didn't hesitate. "Morale doesn't come from wielding power without question," he said, his voice cutting through the clamor like a blade. "It comes from earning respect yours and theirs. If my reforms rattle the old ways, good. Change isn't supposed to feel comfortable." His words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to anyone listening, a reminder that unchecked authority could rot even the strongest foundations. Davis wasn't content to fight his battles from behind a desk. He rolled up his sleeves and stepped into the community, determined to mend the frayed threads that tied the police to the people they served. He forged partnerships with local group churches, youth centers, neighborhood councils, pouring hours into programs that brought officers out of their cruisers and into the lives of residents. At a cookout in the heart of Oakwood, the air thick with the smoky scent of grilling meat and the hum of laughter, Officer Ramirez stood awkwardly in his civilian clothes, a plate of ribs in hand. A small boy, no older than 7, shuffled toward him, his wide eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Are you one of the good ones?" the child whispered, his voice so soft it nearly drowned in the chatter around them. Ramirez's heart clenched at the question, a pang of something raw and unspoken. He knelt down, meeting the boy's gaze with a warm, unguarded smile. "I'm trying to be," he said gently, "and I'm working hard so we all can be." The boy nodded, a tiny spark of trust flickering to life, and Ramirez felt the moment settle deep in his chest, a fragile, fleeting victory that made every struggle worthwhile. Not everyone shared that hope. The reforms carved a jagged line through the department, and some officers chose to walk away rather than bend. Their resignations landed on Davis's desk like silent protests, each one a reminder of the cost of change. Others stayed, but resisted in subtler ways, skipping training sessions with half-hearted excuses, exploiting gaps in the new rules with a smirk. Davis saw it all, the defiance in their eyes, the quiet sabotage in their actions. Yet he pressed on, buoyed by the slow but steady signs of progress. Complaints about misconduct trickled down, a whisper of relief after years of clamor. Surveys, tentative and imperfect, hinted at a shift. People were beginning to see the police not as faceless enforcers, but as part of the fabric of Oakwood. Local leaders, once skeptical, now spoke his name with cautious admiration, and whispers of his work spread to departments beyond the state line. The tide turned decisively when Davis threw open the doors to an independent oversight committee. The invitation wasn't a gesture, it was a gauntlet, a dare to shine a light on every corner of his department. The committee's report landed with a thud, its pages unflinching in their honesty. It praised the strides made, but laid bare the flaws, still festering pockets of bias, lapses in accountability. Where others might have bristled, Davis leaned in. At a press conference, his voice steady despite the weight of the findings, he faced the crowd. "This isn't about being flawless," he said, his hands resting lightly on the podium. "It's about moving forward. We're not there yet, but we're not standing still either." His candor disarmed the skeptics, turning criticism into a rallying cry. The department began to shift, shedding the reluctant and embracing those who shared his vision. New recruits arrived, their eyes bright with purpose, screened not just for skill, but for heart, empathy, humility, a hunger to serve rather than command. The community felt the change too. Meetings that once crackled with rage shouted accusations. Trembling hands pointing across the room softened into something new. Citizens brought ideas, not just grievances, their voices rising with cautious optimism. Officers listened, really listened, and relationships long shattered began to mend, piece by fragile piece. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Davis returned to the neighborhood where it all began. The street, once a battleground of fear and mistrust, now buzzed with life. Families lingered on porches, their laughter spilling into the air. Children darted along the sidewalks, their footsteps a joyful rhythm against the pavement. An elderly woman approached him, her steps slow but deliberate, her face etched with decades of worry now easing into a quiet smile. She clasped his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You stood up when we couldn't," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "You fought for what's right." Nearby, a teenager in a faded hoodie shouted, "Chief Davis, you're a hero." The words echoed down the street, drawing a small crowd. Davis smiled, but his hand rose gently, deflecting the praise. "I'm no hero," he said, his tone humble yet resolute. "I'm just doing my job the way it ought to be done." The people pressed closer, their faces a mix of relief and pride. A man stepped forward, his broad shoulders hunched as if carrying years of unseen burdens. "I've been stopped too many times to count," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of memory. "Treated like I didn't belong here. You've shown us it can be different. Thank you." Davis met his gaze, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The fight's not done," he said softly. "But together, we'll keep pushing. Change isn't my night, it's ours." The applause that followed wasn't planned, but it swelled naturally, a wave of sound rolling through the street. Back at the station, the transformation deepened. Officers who'd once dragged their feet now saw the purpose behind the rules, their reluctance giving way to quiet pride. The rookies brought a spark, their energy infectious as they trained under Davis's steady hand. At a staff meeting, he stood before them, veterans with weathered faces, newbies with eager eyes, and spoke with a clarity that filled the room. "This isn't just about enforcing laws anymore," he said. "It's about trust. Every choice we make, every move, it's a mirror held up to us and this town. Let's make sure it's one we can stand to look at." The nods came slowly at first, then spread, a shared understanding taking root. Davis's story didn't stay confined to Oakwood. It spilled across borders, picked up by news outlets hungry for hope amid the chaos of the world. His name became a spark, igniting debates about what law enforcement could be. Departments far and wide reached out, their questions tentative but earnest. "Though, do we start?" At a national conference, Davis stood before a sea of face cops, lawmakers, activists, and let his truth ring out. "Justice isn't locked in a courtroom," he said, his voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. "It's in every moment, every exchange. It's about using power to shield, not to wound. And it's about all of us building something better together." The room erupted, the sound a thunderclap of agreement, but Davis didn't bask in it. For him, the work stretched endlessly ahead. Back home, the neighborhood bore the marks of his fight. Where he'd once been pinned against a wall, a mural now rose vivid colors, painting him tall and unbroken, the words "justice for all" blazing beneath. On the anniversary of that dark day, the community gathered there, a tapestry of voices and faces. Davis stood among them, not above, his presence quiet but steady. "This isn't about me," he said, his words carrying over the hum of the crowd. "It's about every one of you who said no more. It's about truth mattering, justice mattering. Together, we've started something real." The cheers that followed were fierce, a blend of joy and resolve. James Davis didn't just uncover the cracks in a flawed system, lit a fire beneath it. His stand wasn't a fleeting gesture but a movement, proof that courage and integrity could topple even the deepest rot. The streets of Oakwood, once heavy with suspicion, now shimmered with possibility. The lesson was stark and unyielding. Power, when twisted, breeds ruin, but when wielded with care, it can heal. Justice isn't a gift handed down, it's a garden cultivated by every hand willing to dig in. And as the sun sank over the tree line, casting long shadows across a town reborn, the message stood clear: truth and fairness, chased with unwavering heart, will always rise. In the heart of Oakwood Heights, a neighborhood where wealth draped itself over every corner like a finely tailored suit, perfection seemed to bloom effortlessly. Rows of pristine white picket fences gleamed under the morning sun, guarding manicured lawns that stretched out like emerald carpets. Gleaming luxury cars rested in expansive driveways, their polished surfaces reflecting the affluence of a community that prided itself on exclusivity. For Officer James Cooper, a man hardened by years on the force, this was his domain, a place where order reigned, and anything out of place prickled at his nerves like an itch he couldn't scratch. That morning, stationed at a routine checkpoint on the edge of this idyllic enclave, he tugged at the stiff collar of his uniform, his eyes narrowing as a sleek black Tesla glided toward his squad car. The car's flawless exterior, its curves catching the light, stirred something in Hyman irritation he couldn't quite name, a flicker of unease that tightened his grip on his clipboard. When the tinted windows slid down with a soft hum, James found himself staring into the steady, unflinching gaze of a black woman in her mid-30s. She wore a tailored blazer that hugged her frame with quiet elegance, the subtle glint of gold jewelry at her neck and wrists catching the sunlight. Her composure was unshakable, her professionalism a stark contrast to the vague suspicion already coiling in James's chest. "Good morning, officer," she said, her voice smooth yet firm, carrying a polite confidence that demanded respect. James didn't offer a greeting in return. Instead, he leaned forward, his shadow falling across her window as he peered into the car's interior, his eyes darting over the leather seats and dashboard as if expecting to uncover some hidden wrongdoing. "License and registration," he snapped, his tone clipped and cold, bypassing any pretense of civility. The woman Emily Carter, though he didn't know her name, yet raised a single, deliberate eyebrow, a fleeting sign of her surprise at his brusqueness. Without a word, she reached for the glove compartment, her movements slow and measured, each gesture calculated to avoid provoking him. She'd been here before, caught in the crosshairs of authority wielded like a blunt weapon, and the weight of that familiarity pressed against her ribs. She handed over her documents with a calm, "Of course," her voice steady despite the tension simmering beneath the surface. James snatched the papers from her, flipping them over with exaggerated care, his fingers lingering as he scanned for any flaw, any excuse to dig deeper. "What brings you to this area?" he asked, his words dripping with skepticism, his gaze flicking between her and the pristine streets of Oakwood Heights stretching out behind him. Emily paused, her mind racing as she weighed her response. She could feel the accusation lurking in his tone, the unspoken assumption that she didn't belong here among the sprawling estates and luxury sedans. "I'm on my way to a meeting," she replied, keeping her voice even, her eyes locked on his. James smirked, a sharp, disbelieving sound escaping his lips. "A meeting?" he echoed, his voice thick with mockery as he gestured toward the neighborhood. "In Oakwood Heights, you know, a lot of crime happens when people wander where they don't fit. You don't look like you live around here." The words hit Emily like a slap, though she refused to flinch. Inside, a storm brewed, anger warring with exhaustion, a bitter recognition of the script she'd seen play out too many times. Still, she held herself together, her expression a mask of restraint. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. "You heard me," James shot back, his hand drifting to the holster at his hip, a subtle flex of power that made his authority tangible. "What kind of meeting are you really going to? And whose car is this?" Emily's breath caught, a quick, involuntary hitch as the weight of his words settled over her. Was it rage that burned in her chest, or the bone-deep weariness of having to justify her existence yet again? She chose her next words with precision, each one a brick in the wall she built to shield herself. "This is my car," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And the meeting I'm heading to is none of your business." That was the spark that ignited James's temper, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he straightened to his full height. "None of my business," he repeated, his voice rising, a dangerous edge creeping in. "Let me tell you something, ma'am. When I see someone driving a car like this, dressed like you, in a place like this, it is my business." Emily leaned back in her seat, her face unreadable. Though her heart pounded against her ribs, she could feel the shift in the air, the way his words carried not just suspicion, but a personal challenge. James stepped away from the Tesla, his boots scuffing the pavement as he began to circle the vehicle like a hawk eyeing its prey. He peered through the windows, scrutinizing the interior with exaggerated intensity, then crouched to inspect the license plate and even the undercarriage, as if some illicit secret might spill out from beneath the chassis. His slow, deliberate movements drew curious glances, from the neighborhood's morning regularsa jogger in neon. Spandex slowed her pace. A dog walker with a yapping terrier paused to gawk. Emily's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles paling as a wave of humiliation washed over her. She could feel their stares, a mix of judgment and pity prickling her skin, but she refused to let it break her. She sat taller, her spine rigid, her eyes fixed ahead, denying James the reaction he seemed to crave. After what felt like an endless parade of scrutiny, he returned to her window, his expression hard. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice a low growl. Emily's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief breaking through her composure. "On what grounds?" she asked, her tone steady but edged with defiance. "I said, step out of the car," he repeated, sharper this time, his hand hovering near his weapon. For a heartbeat, Emily held his gaze, weighing her options, the air between them crackling with unspoken stakes. Then, with a quiet exhale, she complied, pushing the door open and stepping onto the pavement. Her heels clicked sharply against the asphalt, a crisp, defiant sound as she stood tall, refusing to let his presence diminish her. James motioned her to the front of the car, and before she could protest, he began a pat-down, his hands brusque and invasive as they searched her pockets and brushed against her blazer. "This is completely unnecessary," she said, her voice trembling faintly despite her efforts to hold steady. "That's not for you to decide," he snapped, his tone dismissive as he rifled through her belongings with a scowl. Emily clenched her jaw, every retort she wanted to hurl at him burning like acid on her tongue. She knew this gamut power he wielded, the way it tilted the world in his favor, and she knew better than to give him more ammunition. When he finally stepped back, apparently unsatisfied, he tossed her documents onto the hood of her car with a careless flick of his wrist. "You're clean," he muttered, the words laced with disappointment, as if he'd been cheated out of a victory. Emily took a slow, deliberate breath, gathering her papers with hands that shook only slightly. She straightened, meeting his gaze with a fire that had been smoldering beneath her calm exterior. "For your information, Officer Cooper," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "I'm on my way to a meeting at the Central Precinct with the Internal Affairs Division. If you must know." James froze, his breath catching as the words sank in. "Internal Affairs," he repeated, his voice faltering for the first time that morning. "That's right," Emily confirmed, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from her blazer with a flick of her fingers. "I'm Emily Carter, the new head of the unit, and thanks to you, I'm late for my first day." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him, each word laced with quiet fury. "You see, Officer Cooper, I've built my career on holding people like you accountable. I know exactly what you were doing just now, and I know why. But don't worry," she added, a faint, bitter smile tugging at her lips. "You'll be seeing a lot more of me soon." With that, she slid back into her Tesla, the engine purring to life as she drove off, leaving James rooted to the spot, his face drained of color, his heart hammering in his chest as the weight of her words crashed over him. He stumbled back to his squad car, barely registering the voice of his partner, Officer Ryan, who had watched the entire exchange from a distance. "Hey, you okay?" "Who was that?" Ryan asked, leaning over with a mix of curiosity and concern. James didn't answer. His hands trembled as he logged into the system, typing her name with fumbling fingers. When her profile flashed onto the screen, Emily Carter, head of Internal Affairs, it hit him like a punch to the gut. Ryan let out a low whistle. "Well, damn," he muttered, shaking his head. "You just picked the wrong woman to mess with." James swallowed hard, his mind spinning as he replayed every moment of their encounter, the way he'd sneered at her, the way he'd humiliated her in front of strangers, the way he'd assumed she didn't belong. It was all unraveling now, a thread he couldn't pull back. "She's going to bury me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the precinct radio. Ryan arched an eyebrow, his usual easygoing demeanor tempered by a flicker of unease. "You think?" James didn't respond. He leaned back in his seat, staring blankly through the windshield as a cold dread settled into his bones. For the first time in his long career, he felt the unfamiliar sting of fear and the gnawing question of whether he'd finally pushed his authority too far. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with an electric undercurrent, a hum of anticipation that set James's nerves on edge. Officers clustered in tight knots, their voices low as whispers about the new internal affairs head rippled through the room like wildfire. "Heard she's tough as nails," one cop murmured over by the coffee machine, his tone a mix of awe and apprehension. "Doesn't tolerate a damn thing," another added, shaking his head as he stirred sugar into his mug. James stood frozen at his desk, his ears burning as fragments of their chatter drifted toward him. Each word felt like a hammer striking a nail into a coffin. He couldn't escape only carved with his name in stark, unforgiving letters. His mind looped back to the day before, to Emily's piercing words and the quiet disdain in her eyes. He'd been blindsided, his confidence shattered, and now the consequences loomed like a storm on the horizon. "Hey, Cooper," the sound of his name jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. Officer Ryan appeared at his side, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, his easy grin faltering as he took in James's ashen face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Still thinking about yesterday?" James didn't reply immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on his computer screen, where he'd been pretending to review reports, the cursor blinking accusingly on an empty page. Ryan took a sip of his coffee and leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Look, man, maybe it won't be so bad. She didn't strike me as the vindictive type. Just apologize, play it cool, she might let it slide." James let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed in the quiet corner of the room. "Let it slide? Ryan, I humiliated her in front of half of Oakwood Heights, and now she's my boss. You think she's just going to forget that?" Ryan shrugged, his optimism unshaken. "I mean, technically, she can't target you just for that. She's got to follow procedure, right?" "Procedure," James muttered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "You think I don't know how this works? I've seen internal affairs tear careers apart for less than what I did. They don't play fair." Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but the room fell silent before he could speak. Every head turned toward the entrance as Emily Carter stepped into the precinct, her presence commanding the space like a force of nature. She wore a sharp navy blazer that seemed to absorb the light, her stride confident and purposeful, a leather briefcase swinging at her side. Her eyes swept the room, cool and assessing, and for a fleeting moment, they locked on James. His stomach dropped, a cold sweat prickling his skin as he realized the lesson unfolding before him. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a reckoning, and he'd abused his power in a way that had drawn its gaze squarely upon him. Emily's arrival wasn't just the start of her tenure, it was the beginning of his consequences, a mirror held up to every assumption he'd wielded like a weapon. As she moved through the precinct, the whispers resumed, but James barely heard them. He was too busy grappling with the truth. Power, when twisted, didn't just harm its target, it carved a path back to its wielder, and he was standing directly in its way. A thick leather folder was tucked snugly beneath her arm as she strode into the room, her face a mask of serene composure, betraying nothing of the storm brewing beneath the surface. The low hum of chatter that had filled the precinct moments before evaporated into an oppressive silence. Officers snapped to attention, spines stiffening as though pulled by invisible strings. Some fumbled nervously with their uniforms, smoothing wrinkles or tugging at collars, their movements betraying a flicker of unease. James, seated near the back, felt a heavy knot twist in his gut. He wanted nothing more than to melt into the faded gray walls, to vanish into the anonymity of the crowd, but the weight of inevitability pinned him in place. Too late now. Emily Carter's piercing gaze swept across the room like a searchlight, cataloging every face with surgical precision. When her eyes landed on him, they lingered edges for a heartbeat, a fleeting pause so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But James felt it, a jolt of recognition that crackled through him like static electricity, a silent whisper of "I see you." Then, as swiftly as it came, her attention shifted, leaving him reeling as she addressed the room. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice cutting through the stillness with the clarity of a blade, steady yet laced with an unshakable authority. "My name is Emily Carter, and as I'm sure most of you have already heard through the precinct grapevine, I'm your new head of internal affairs." She paused, letting her words settle, her presence commanding the space without effort. I won't keep you long today. My purpose here is simple: to introduce myself and lay out what I expect from each and every one of you." Nervous glances darted between the officers like ricocheting bullets, but no one dared speak. Emily paced slowly, deliberately, her heels tapping a measured rhythm against the tiled floor. "My role," she continued, her tone sharpening, "is to ensure this department runs on a foundation of integrity, accountability, and fairness. I'm not here to win your affection, nor am I here to start petty battles. I'm here to uphold what's right for this department, for the community we serve, and for the badge you wear." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, a gauntlet thrown down before them all. James's palms grew slick with sweat, his fingers flexing involuntarily as her voice seemed to echo inside his skull. She wasn't speaking to him directly. Her message was for the room, but every syllable landed like a blow, striking at the guilt festering within him. "I'm well aware of the tension that exists between internal affairs and the rest of the force," Emily admitted, coming to a stop in the center of the room, her posture unwavering. "I know some of you might already view me as the adversary, the outsider come to tear you down. Let me be perfectly clear, I don't want to be your enemy. My goal is to work alongside you, to strengthen this department, not fracture it." Her gaze swept the room once more, and for a fleeting second, it brushed against James again, a flicker of intensity that made his breath catch. "But make no mistake," she added, her voice dropping to a steely edge, "if you cross the line, if you misuse the power entrusted to you, if you act as though the law doesn't apply to you, you'll find out fast that I'm not someone you want to test." The room held its breath, the silence so thick it felt like a living thing pressing down on them. "Any questions?" Emily asked, one eyebrow arching slightly, daring someone to speak. No one did. The officers sat frozen, their eyes fixed on anything but Hercafee cups, scuffed boots, the cracked ceiling tiles. "Good," she said, her tone softening just a fraction, a hint of warmth breaking through the steel. "I look forward to working with you all. My office is upstairs if you need me." With that, she turned on her heel, the sharp click of her shoes against the floor marking her exit like the ticking of a clock, counting down to judgment. The moment she disappeared up the stairs, the room exhaled, erupting into a flurry of hushed whispers and stifled curses. James slumped back in his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. He knew it was only a matter of time before she summoned him, before the reckoning he'd been dreading arrived. Sure enough, less than 10 minutes later, his computer chimed with a new email. The subject line stared back at him, cold and unfeeling. Meeting request from Emily Carter to James Cooper. Time, 3 p.m. Location, Internal Affairs Office. His stomach plummeted, a wave of nausea washing over him as he reread the words, each one tightening the vice around his chest. Ryan, his partner, leaned over from the next desk, peering at the screen with a low whistle. 3 o'clock. Huck, she doesn't waste time, does she? James groaned, dragging a hand through his disheveled hair, strands sticking to his damp forehead. "What the hell am I supposed to say to her, Ryan shrugged, leaning back in his chair with a casualness that only deepened James's frustration. "Be straight with her, man. Own up to what you did. You messed up big time, but maybe she'll respect you more if you don't try to dodge it." James wasn't convinced. Respect from Emily Carter, the woman who just stared down an entire room of seasoned cops without blinking. Doubt gnawed at him, but he had no time to dwell on it. At exactly 3 p.m., James stood outside her office, his fist hovering over the door. His pulse thundered in his ears, each beat a reminder of the shame he carried. He knocked, the sound weak and tentative. "Come in," came her voice from the other side, crisp and unwavering. He stepped inside, the air feeling colder, sharper, as though the room itself knew his secrets. Emily sat behind a polished wooden desk, her leather folders splayed open before her, a pen poised in her hand as she scribbled a final note. She didn't look up immediately, leaving him to stand there, awkward and exposed, his mouth dry as sandpaper. When she finally raised her eyes to meet his, her expression remained a blank slate, unreadable yet piercing. "Officer Cooper," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. He sat, his movements stiff, every muscle coiled with tension. She leaned back in her seat, folding her hands in her lap, and for a long moment, she simply watched him. James squirmed under the weight of her scrutiny, fighting the urge to blurt out an excuse, an apology, anything to break the suffocating silence. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked at last, her tone even but probing. "Yes, ma'am." James replied, his voice tight, barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, an eyebrow lifting slightly. "Do you?" He faltered, the certainty draining from him. "It's about yesterday, at the checkpoint, right?" he ventured. Emily nodded, reaching into her folder to pull out a single sheet of paper. She slid it across the desk toward him, the motion deliberate, almost ceremonial. "This is your incident report," she said. "I want you to read it aloud." James's stomach twisted into a knot. "Out loud?" he echoed, his voice cracking. "Yes," she replied, her tone brooking no argument. Her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made him feel small. He picked up the page, his hands trembling as his eyes skimmed the words he'd written in haste the day before. "Stopped a black female driver in Oakwood Heights," he began, his voice faltering. "Vehicle was a Tesla Model S. Driver appeared out of place." The words tasted bitter on his tongue, each one a jagged shard of regret. He paused, unable to go on, but Emily's voice cut through the silence. "Keep going." He swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue, every sentence a confession of his own failing assumptions scrawled in black ink. Accusations built on nothing but prejudice. When he finished, he dared to look up at her, his face burning with shame. Emily leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk, her gaze unrelenting. "Do you know what this reads like, Officer Cooper?" He shook his head, mute. "It reads like prejudice," she said, her words blunt, unsoftened by pity. "It reads like someone who judges people by how they look, not what they do. Do you understand what that means?" "Yes, ma'am," he whispered, the weight of her accusation pressing down on him like a physical force. She studied him for a long moment, her silence more damning than her words. Then she nodded, a single, sharp motion. "Good. Because this isn't just about me, Officer Cooper. It's about every person you've ever pulled over, every life you've touched, every choice you've made while wearing that badge. Power isn't a privilege to wield carelessly, it's a responsibility. And when you abuse it, the consequences ripple far beyond a single moment." Her voice softened slightly, but the steel remained. "This isn't over. You'll hear from me again soon." She closed her folder with a decisive snap, signaling the end of the meeting. James stumbled out of her office and into the break room, collapsing into a chair. The sandwich he'd grabbed earlier sat untouched before him, its wrapper crinkled and forgotten. The precinct buzzed around him, but the noise felt distant, muffled by the chaos in his mind. His colleagues moved with a cautious edge now, their usual banter replaced by sit-along glances and whispered theories about Emily Carter's reign. Every look cast his way felt like an indictment, a silent chorus of "you brought this on yourself." Ryan slid into the seat across from him, his voice low and steady. "You look like hell, Coop." James didn't reply, his fingers picking at the sandwich wrapper, peeling it back in jagged strips. "I get it," Ryan pressed, leaning closer. "She's coming down hard. But maybe this is your chance to fix things." James's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with frustration. "Fix things? How? Tell her I'm not some bigot. Rewrite what I did." Ryan sighed, undeterred. "You messed up. We all have. But sitting here drowning in it won't change a damn thing. You're gonna face her again, and when you do, you'd better figure out how to own it." Before James could argue, the break room door swung open. Officer Alvarez stepped inside, her weary frame taut with purpose, a clipboard clutched in her hand. "Cooper," she barked, her voice clipped. "You're needed upstairs. Now." James's stomach lurched, dread pooling in his chest. Ryan shot him a sympathetic look, but James ignored it, hauling himself to his feet. His legs felt like lead as he followed Alvarez out, the hallway stretching endlessly before him. Emily's office loomed ahead, its door a silent sentinel. Inside, the air was frigid, the fluorescent lights casting stark shadows across her pristine desk. She sat there, engrossed in a report, her pen scratching notes with relentless precision. She didn't acknowledge him at first, leaving him to stand rigid, hands clasped behind his back, his nerves fraying with every tick of the clock. When she finally looked up, Her expression was impassive, but her eyes bore into him with a clarity that stripped him bare. "Officer Cooper," she said, her hands folding neatly atop the desk. "I assume you know why you're here." "Yes, ma'am," he replied, forcing his voice to hold steady despite the turmoil churning inside. She tilted her head, studying him. "Are you sure?" He hesitated, choosing his words with care. "Because of my conduct during the traffic stop." She nodded slowly, her movements deliberate. "That's part of it. But it's not just one incident, Officer Cooper. It's a pattern of thread woven through your record." A chill crept up his spine as she opened a folder and slid another document toward him. "I've reviewed your history. Do you know how many complaints of racial bias have been filed against you in the last 5 years?" His throat closed, words failing him as he stared at the paper, its lines blurring into a condemnation of his past. Emily's voice cut through the haze, steady and unrelenting. "Justice isn't a suggestion, officer. It's a standard. And when power is abused, it doesn't just harm the victim, it erodes trust, fractures communities, and tarnishes everything we stand for. You're part of that equation now. What you do next decides how deep those consequences run." James stood there, the weight of her words sinking into him. A lesson carved in stone. Power unchecked breeds chaos, and justice, when ignored, demands a reckoning. The room felt suffocating as James sat there, his broad shoulders hunched under the weight of Emily's gaze. He couldn't bring himself to lift his eyes from the worn wooden table between them, its surface scratched and stained from years of tense conversations just like this one. Emily's voice sliced through the heavy silence, sharp yet steady, answering the question he hadn't dared to ask aloud. "7, she said, her tone carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd seen too much. 7 complaints filed against you, James. And do you want to guess how many of those were actually looked into?" His throat tightened, words failing him as he gave a small, helpless shake of his head. 2, she went on, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The rest, tossed out. Not enough evidence, they said." She leaned forward just a fraction, her piercing gray eyes locking onto him like a spotlight pinning a fugitive in the dark. "But here's what I see when I look at this pile of papers, James. I see a pattern of thread woven through every report. Prejudice, profiling, abuse of the power pinned to your chest. And yesterday, you went and stitched another ugly knot into that tapestry." James's hands balled into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening as a storm of emotions churned inside him: anger, shame, defiance, all crashing together like waves against a crumbling cliff. "With all due respect, ma'am," he managed, his voice low and strained, "I've always followed protocol. I've done my job the way I was trained." Emily's eyebrow arched, a silent challenge that cut deeper than any words could. "By the book, Hub," she said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Is that what you call pulling over a black woman in a sleek, polished Lexusher car gleaming under the midday sun, searching her without a shred of cause, and leaving her trembling on the sidewalk, humiliated in front of a crowd of onlookers? Is that your idea of good policing, Officer Cooper?" His mouth opened, a protest forming on his tongue, but it withered away before it could take shape. The truth hung there, undeniable, and he had no shield to raise against it. Emily eased back into her chair, the creak of the leather filling the silence she let linger, thick and oppressive like the air before a thunderstorm. "Do you know why I took this job, James?" she asked after a moment, her voice softening just enough to catch him off guard. He shook his head again, uncertain where this detour was leading, but feeling the ground shift beneath him all the same. "I have a little brother," she said, her gaze drifting to some distant point beyond the drab office walls, as if she could see him standing there. "Marcus, bright kid, sharp as a tack, with a heart bigger than most people deserve, always talking about changing the world, making it better." A ghost of a smile flickered across her face, tender and fleeting, before it hardened into something colder. "A few years back, Marcus got picked up. They said he stole a Cara Mercedes he was driving because he worked for the guy who owned it, parking cars at some fancy downtown hotel. He tried to tell them, practically begging them to listen, but those officers, they didn't hear a word. All they saw was a young black man in a car that didn't fit, and that was enough. They dragged him off in cuffs, threw him in a cell for 2 nights, James, before the truth crawled out. By then, it didn't matter. The damage was carved into him, into his trust, his hope, his belief in the system we're supposed to uphold. Her voice grew icy, each word a shard of glass embedding itself in James's chest. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch someone you love shrink under that kind of suspicion? To see the light in their eyes dim because they realize the badge that's supposed to protect them sees them as a threat instead. James stared at the floor, the scuffed linoleum blurring as guilt clawed its way up his spine. He couldn't meet her eyes, didn't dare. That's why I'm here, Officer Cooper, Emily said, her tone steady as steel. To make damn sure what happened to Marcus doesn't happen to anyone else. To hold people like you accountable when you step over that line. The words landed like a fist to his stomach, knocking the air out of him. He wanted to argue, to insist he wasn't the villain she painted him to be, that he was just a cop doing his job in a messy world. But deep down, in the quiet corners of his mind he rarely visited, he knew she wasn't wrong. He started, his voice cracking like dry twigs underfoot. I didn't mean to, Emily cut him off, her words sharp and unyielding. Intentions don't matter, James, impact does. Your choices ripple up, they bruise people, they break trust. Every time you flex that authority without cause, you don't just hurt the person you stop. You chip away at the faith an entire community has in us. You make it tougher for the good cops, the ones who actually give a damn to do their jobs. Without wading through the mistrust you've sown, James swallowed hard, his chest constricting as the weight of her accusations settled over him like a lead blanket. Emily watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she let out a quiet sigh. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately, she said, her voice flattening into something procedural, detached. While you're out, you'll attend mandatory training, racial bias ethics, the works. When you come back, we'll be watching you closely. Do you understand? He nodded, a numb, mechanical motion. Yes, ma'am, he muttered, barely audible. Emily snapped the folder shut with a crisp thud and slid it aside, the sound echoing in the small room. You're dismissed. James rose, his legs unsteady beneath him, and shuffled toward the door. He paused, hand on the knob, and glanced back at her. Chief Carter, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. For everything. She didn't answer right away, her silence stretching out like a judge weighing a sentence. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm but firm, a quiet command wrapped in resolve. Don't apologize to me, Officer Cooper. Say it to the people you've hurt, then prove you mean it. He nodded once more, a tight, jerky motion, and slipped out of the office. The door clicked shut behind him, but Emily's words clung to him like damp fog, heavy and inescapable. Days later, James found himself in a place that felt alien despite his years on the force. He sat rigid in a hard plastic chair, the kind that dug into your back no matter how you shifted, in a cramped, windowless room on the second floor of the city's police academy. The walls were a dull beige, scuffed from years of neglect, and the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and dust. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed like restless insects, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the half-dozen officers scattered around the room. Some slouched, arms crossed, their faces etched with boredom or defiance. Others stared ahead, eyes glassy as if they'd already checked out. James felt their glances quick, sidelong looks that prickled his skin. He wondered if they knew why he was here, if they'd heard about the complaints, the leave, the woman in the Lexus whose life he'd upended for no reason he could justify anymore. At the front of the room stood the trainer, a middle-aged man with a weary frame and a calm, measured presence that seemed out of place amid the tension. His badge identified him as a consultant from some national policing reform group, and he held a dry erase marker in one hand, scribbling the words implicit bias in bold. Uneven letters across a whiteboard, the phrase stared back at James, stark and accusing, and his jaw tightened instinctively. This was day one of the training Emily had mandated, a grueling series of sessions, meant to peel back the layers of his instincts, his decisions, his failures. She'd called it his path to accountability, but sitting there, surrounded by strangers in a room that felt like a cage, he wasn't sure what he was supposed to find at the end of it. He shifted in his seat, the plastic creaking under his weight, and crossed his arms tightly over his chest, He hadn't slept much since that meeting with Emily. Her voice echoed in his head at night, her story about Marcus playing on a loop, slicing deeper each time he replayed it. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar gnawing at him, raw and unrelenting. "All right," the trainer said, his voice cutting through the room's uneasy quiet. "Let's start simple. What pops into your head when you hear the word bias?" The question lingered, unanswered. As the officers exchanged hesitant looks, no one wanted to be the first to crack the silence. James kept his eyes fixed on the table, tracing a faint scratch with his thumb. His mind racing, but his lips sealed. Finally, a younger officer barely out of the academy, with a nervous energy that radiated off him, popped up. I guess it's judging someone unfairly." His voice wavered, like he wasn't sure if he'd stepped into a trap. The trainer nodded, a small, approving tilt of his head. "Good place to start," he said, turning to jot judgment beneath implicit bias on the board. "Bias is how we filter the world, how we size up people, situations, everything. It's not always something we're aware of, but it steers us anyway, shapes what we do, how we react." He pivoted back to face them, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Now, let's dig a little deeper, get uncomfortable. Who here's ever made a snap call about someone based on how they look, their race, where they're from?" The air in the room thickened, the question hanging like a dare. James's chest squeezed tight, his first impulse to shrink back, to deny it, to build a wall of excuses. But Emily's face flashed in his mind, her calm, unyielding stare, and he faltered. Slowly, almost against his will, he lifted his hand. The trainer's eyes flicked to him, a faint nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Officer Cooper," he said, his tone free of judgment. A few others followed, hands creeping up reluctantly, though most stayed stubbornly still. "Now," the trainer pressed on, "think about what those assumptions did. How'd they hit the person you were dealing with? How'd they change the way you did your job?" James's mind spun, a flood of memories rushing in unbidden. The kid in the beat-up sedan he'd pulled over in a gated neighborhood, his voice shaking as he swore the car was his. The woman outside the gas station, her hands trembling as he patted her down because her quick glances had pinged his radar. And the woman in the Lexusher Dignity, stripped away on a busy street, her eyes burning with a mix of fear and fury as he rifled through her purse. He'd told himself it was routine, just part of the gig. But now, under the trainer's steady gaze, those justifications felt flimsy, hollow. The days that followed were a slow unraveling. The sessions weren't brutal in the physical sense, but they tore at something deeper, forcing James to face the man in the mirror he'd avoided for too long. One exercise stuck with him, gnawing at his thoughts long after the room emptied. The trainer passed out photo snapshots of strangers, faces frozen in everyday moments. A black teenager in a hoodie, headphones dangling around his neck, hands buried in his pockets. James stared at the image, his pen hovering over the paper. His gut reaction came fast, automatic. Trouble. He froze, the word glaring back at him in his own handwriting, and a wave of disgust rolled through him. When the trainer called on him, he hesitated, his throat dry. "I wrote trouble," he admitted, his voice barely audible. The trainer nodded, not with condemnation, but with a quiet curiosity. "Thanks for that, Officer Cooper. Now tell Muhad that picture says trouble to you." James looked again, searching the boy's face, the casual slump of his shoulders, the neutral expression. "I don't know," he said finally, the confession tasting bitter. "Exactly," the trainer replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "That's not coming from him. It's coming from you, from the stories you've been told, the shortcuts your mind's learned to take. That's what we're here to unpack." The realization hit James hard, a sucker punch to the soul. He saw it then, how deep those roots went, how they'd tangled around his instincts, his choices, his badge. And as the training stretched on, he began to understand something bigger. Justice wasn't just about catching the bad guys. It was about the consequences of power, the wreckage left behind when it was wielded carelessly. For every stop, every search, every snap judgment, there was a cost, and he'd been blind to it for too long. The cool evening air settled heavily over James Cooper's small apartment, the kind of stillness that amplifies every creak of the floorboards and hum of the refrigerator. For years as a police officer had carved a deep sense of pride into him, pride in being the kind of cop who didn't flinch, who tackled the toughest beats with a steady hand and an unflinching gaze. He'd always seen himself as tough but fair, a guardian of order in a chaotic world. Yet now, as he sat alone on a worn-out couch, the flickering light of his laptop casting shadows across his face, that certainty felt like a fragile illusion crumbling under the weight of doubt. His fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly as he began to type. The words stumbled out at first, jagged and reluctant, like a man stepping onto thin ice. But soon they surged forth, raw and unfiltered, spilling from a place inside him he'd kept locked away for too long. "Dear Chief Carter," he wrote, the cursor blinking like a silent accusation. "I don't even know if you'll bother reading this, but I can't keep it in anymore. I owe you an apology, one that goes beyond how I treated you, though that alone haunts me. It's about everything that moment exposed. For years, I convinced myself I was just doing my job, that every choice I made was about keeping the city safe, but that's a lie I've been hiding behind. The truth is, I let my own biases steer me. I sized people up without a second thought, judged them before they even opened their mouths, and called it instinct, good policing. Now I see how blind I was, how wrong. You tried to tell me, and I wouldn't listen. My actions didn't just hurt the people I targeted. They chipped away at something bigger, fragile trust between us and the community we're supposed to protect. I can't erase the damage I've done, but I need you to know I'm trying to change. These training sessions have ripped me open, forced me to look at parts of myself I'd rather ignore. It's brutal, but I'm thankful for it, and I'm thankful for you, for not giving up on me when it would have been easier to let me sink. I don't expect you to forgive me, haven't earned that, but I'm telling you now. I'm in this to do better, not just for me, but for the people I swore to serve. Thank you for giving me this chance. Sincerely, James Cooper. He sat there, staring at the screen, the glow illuminating the lines etched into his forehead. His chest tightened as he reread every word, each one a shard of guilt and hope tangled together. For a long moment, he hesitated, his finger hovering over the send button. What if Chief Carter didn't care? What if she saw it as too little, too late? But as he pressed down and the email vanished into the ether, a strange calm washed over him. It wasn't absolution, not even close, but it was a step, a small, shaky move toward something better. Weeks earlier, James had stood outside the community center, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his faded jacket. The building thrummed with life, families trickling in for workshops, kids darting across the courtyard with shrieks of laughter, volunteers hauling crates of canned goods and fresh produce from a battered van. It was a world he'd never belonged to, a place he'd once driven past without a second glance. Now, 6 weeks into his mandatory leave, he found himself here, attending yet another session of the bias training his superiors had forced upon him. He'd shown up to every one so far, each more grueling than the last. The trainers were relentless, their voices cutting through the room like a blade as they laid bare the realities of systemic racism, the quiet poison of implicit bias, and the wreckage left behind by police misconduct. For James, it was like standing in front of a warped mirror. Forced to confront a reflection, he barely recognized a man who'd spent years wielding power, without questioning its cost. Stepping inside, he scanned the room. A dozen other officers sat scattered among the folding chairs, most with arms crossed tight over their chests, their faces a mix of defiance and exhaustion. James knew that look had worn it himself in the beginning, a shield against the discomfort gnawing at him. But something had shifted over the weeks, a crack in the armor he'd built around his beliefs. The first session had nearly broken him. He'd sat rigid, jaw clenched, as community members took the floor, their voices trembling with anger and pain. A teenage boy, no older than 16, spoke of being accused of shoplifting at a corner store, his only crime fitting a vague description scribbled on a notepad. His eyes burned with a quiet fury as he recounted how the officer seemed like Jamesh had pinned him against a wall, the boy's skinny frame trembling under the weight of suspicion. Then there was the mother, her voice steady but heavy with exhaustion, who described teaching her 12-year-old son to keep his hands out of his pockets, to speak softly and never run, no matter how scared he was if a cop ever stopped him. and the man middle-aged, with deep lines carved into his face, would lost 3 years to a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit. His life unraveling while James and his colleagues moved on without a backward glance. At first, James had bristled at their stories, each one feeling like a jab aimed straight at him. He'd wanted to argue, to defend himself, to say he wasn't that kind of cop. But as the sessions wore on, those voices burrowed into him, relentless and unshakable. They followed him home, echoing in the silence of his apartment, painting faces he couldn't unsee. These weren't just problems to be policed, they were people, flesh and blood, carrying wounds he'd helped inflict. 2 weeks after that letter, James returned to the precinct, his badge clipped to his belt once more. His reinstatement came with strictures, every move watched, his record under a microscope, the threat of termination looming like a storm cloud. But the scrutiny from above paled next to the shift he felt among his peers. Ryan, his closest friend on the force, greeted him with a handshake that lingered too long, his eyes searching James's face as if trying to find the man he used to know. Others kept their distance, their glances laced with pity or suspicion, like he was a grenade with a loose pin. And then there were the ones who didn't bother hiding their disdain, hushed mutters about woke nonsense trailing him down the hall. James didn't fight back. He didn't have the strength to argue. Instead, he threw himself into the job net the old way, chasing arrests and stats. But a new kind of work. He signed up for community outreach, something he'd once scoffed at as a waste of time. He sat with local leaders in cramped church basements, listening as they poured out their frustrations, broken streetlights, kids with nowhere safe to go, a police presence that felt more like occupation than protection. He asked questions, took notes, and promised to push for change, even when their skeptical stares told him they didn't believe a word. He started mentoring too, spending his Saturdays on a cracked basketball court with a group of at-risk teens. The first few weeks were rough. Kids eyed him warily, their shoulders hunched, waiting for the cop to show through. Parents lingered nearby, arms crossed, whispering among themselves about whether he'd stick around or just disappear like the rest. But James kept coming back, week after week, trading his uniform for a sweatshirt and sneakers, dribbling a ball and cracking terrible jokes until a few of the kids started to laugh. Slowly, the walls came down, not all at once, but in small, hard-won moments, like when a boy named Marcus asked him to check his math homework, or when a mother nodded at him across the court, her expression softening just enough to hint at trust. It was at one of these events, a book drive organized by the mentorship group, that James saw Chief Emily Carter again. He was knee-deep in a pile of paperbacks, helping a cluster of kids sort them into stacks. When he caught sight of her near the entrance, she stood out even in her plain slacks and blouse, her presence quiet but commanding as she spoke with a volunteer. James froze, a dog-eared copy of The Outsiders slipping from his hands. He hadn't seen her since that tense meeting in her office, when she'd laid out his suspension with a voice that cut through his defenses. He'd thought about reaching out, drafted emails, scribbled notes, but every attempt felt inadequate, a hollow gesture against the weight of his mistakes. Before he could duck out of sight, she turned, her eyes locking onto his. She crossed the room with steady steps, her face unreadable but not cold. "Officer Cooper," she said, her tone clipped but professional, like she was testing the waters. "Chief Carter," he replied, straightening up, brushing dust off his jeans. His throat felt dry, words tangling in his head. She glanced over his shoulder at the kids, who were now arguing over whether Harry Potter belonged in the fantasy or adventure pile. "Looks like you've been keeping busy." "Yes, ma'am," he said, clearing his throat. "It's part of the mentorship program. We do stuff like this on weekends, book drives, cleanups, whatever they need." She nodded, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in the bustle of volunteers and the chatter of families. "It's good work. Necessary work." James shifted on his feet, the précifit was sitting uneasily on him. Silence stretched between them, thick with everything he hadn't said. Finally, he forced the words out, his voice low and unsteady. "Chief Carter, I've been meaning to thank you for everything, for holding me accountable, for giving me a shot to change." She looked at him then, really looked, her sharp eyes softening just a fraction. "Change isn't easy, Officer Cooper. it takes more than good intentions. It's effort, humility, listening when you'd rather walk away. You've started down that road. But it's a long one. Don't think it ends here. I know, he said quickly, eager to prove he wasn't deluding himself. I'm not pretending I've fixed it all. I've got a lot to make up for. But I'm trying. I mean that. She studied him, her silence stretching long enough to make him wonder if he'd said too much. Then she nodded, a small, measured gesture. Good. Because this isn't just about you. It's about the people out there. She tilted her head toward the courtyard, where laughter and conversation spilled through the open doors. The ones who need to know you're not just another uniform waiting to let them down. They deserve better. So do the officers who actually honor what that badge means. Her words hit him like a punch, not cruel but true, sinking deep into his chest. He nodded, swallowing hard. As she turned to go, he called after her, the impulse overriding his nerves. Chief. She paused, glancing back. I'm sorry, he said, the words tumbling out rough and earnest. For what I did. For how I treated you. I can't take it back, but I need you to know I regret it. Every damn day. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then a faint smile flickered across her face, not warm, but not dismissive either. Regret's a start, Officer Cooper. But it's what you do with it that counts. Keep showing up. Keep doing the work. Maybe one day, we won't need to have these talks anymore. She walked away, her footsteps fading into the hum of the crowd, but her words stayed with him. Sharp and steady, a compass he couldn't ignore. Months later, James stood at the back of a packed auditorium, the air thick with anticipation. Chief Carter was on stage, addressing a community policing forum with a voice that carried both authority and hope. She spoke of accountability, of rebuilding trust, of a future where safety didn't come at the expense of justice. James listened, leaning against the wall, his arms loose at his sides. Her passion stirred something in him, a reminder of how far he'd come, and how much further he had to go. The old James, the one who'd seen the world in stark blacks and whites, was gone, replaced by someone still figuring out the grays. He slipped out as the event wound down, unnoticed by the crowd, the applause fading behind him. He didn't need anyone to see him, didn't need a pat on the back. What mattered was the work, slow, messy, unglamorous grind of earning back what he'd broken, one day at a time. As he climbed into his car, her voice echoed in his head, keep doing the work. And for the first time in years, James felt like he just might.